Trump definitely did ask for an investigation into the Bidens in that phone call. The question is if he conditioned $391 million and or a White House meeting on that investigation being publicly announced on American television. Word gets out that the White House Office of Management and Budget was somehow delaying the checks for Ukrainian weapons. And the central question remains, why?
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the 206th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to this show basically is about Congress, and there's been some pretty big congressional news lately, which is that President Donald Trump has been impeached by the House of Representatives. Now, what that means is that the House of Representatives has essentially played the role of grand jury, indicting Trump on two charges, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. And on those charges, the Senate may remove him from office after a Senate trial. And since this is actually happening, I decided to watch every minute of every public fact-finding hearing to find out for myself and for you how strong the evidence against Donald Trump really is. I also decided to do this because so many of you have reached out to me to say that you're confused, you have no idea what's going on, and that you trust nobody is telling you the truth, which I totally get because the partisan spin in all of this has been insufferable and hopelessly tainted by bullshit. And so for this episode, I clipped only witness testimony. There is exactly one clip that you're going to hear today that features only a member of Congress. Because with all the bullshit and spin, I think we need to hear the key testimony for ourselves. But I understand that almost none of us have the time to watch over 40 hours of testimony. And so I created this episode despite the storm that always blows my way when I produce an episode about a mainstream story. But because I'm a full-blown masochist, I also decided to share with you in this episode my thoughts on all of this, because I strongly considered just putting the information out there and giving no conclusion. But that actually felt like the coward's way out. And so I will tell you at the end of this episode where I personally landed on all this. But my opinion really doesn't matter. This is about sharing the information with you. And I know that no matter what I say on this topic, half the country is going to want to scream at me. And so all I ask is that you don't. Please agree with me, disagree with me, fine, but please be civil. And if you want to all caps scream at someone online, please scream at your senators because they're the only ones left with any power to do anything about any of this anyway. I'm really not looking for a fight by producing this episode. I'm just calling it like I see it. And I don't expect you to take my word for anything in this episode or with any of my episodes, because I provide you with extensive show notes with every document, article, and sound clip that I use. And sound clips in particular are key for this episode. With lots of hearings that were 5, 6, 7 hours long, I felt it was necessary to take the time to provide you with timestamps along with accurate enough transcripts so that you'll be able to easily figure out which clip it is that you want to find and find it within the hearing to hear what was said around the clip, to hear it in context. This is the most valuable thing I do, the show notes, and it's the thing that makes Congressional Dish different from just about every other podcast. I back up what I say. You can see exactly where I'm getting my information from, so please use this resource. It comes in really handy when drunk uncle is spouting corporate media planted nonsense at the holiday table. And if you appreciate, enjoy, or in any way value the work that went into producing this episode, please pay for it. Because you won't hear a single advertisement on this show, and that's on purpose. I turn all advertisements down so that I can tell you exactly what I believe to be true, regardless of how unpopular that may be. And no matter what, I'm in trouble for producing this episode already. Emotions are running very high, which is why I crowdfund this show. This is my full-time job. And I'm going to get fired by people for this. 100% I'm going to get fired. But I'll get tipped by people too. But with this funding model, no corporate overlord can threaten to withhold aid from me in order to get me to change the show. And so, yeah, that's how we do things here. And you can find all of the contribution options, of which there are many, in every episode's show notes, including the show notes for this episode. And also, please share the podcast with your friends. Word of mouth is the best way for podcasts to grow, and I spend exactly $0 of your dollars paying Facebook and Twitter or anyone else to market this podcast. This is a team effort here, and the marketing I leave to you. So thanks for understanding and for supporting the show if you have already. So now, let's get into the impeachment of Donald Trump. And here's the backstory on the Trump impeachment. Basically, President Donald Trump is accused of trying to get the new president of Ukraine to launch investigations that might hurt the Democrats, former Vice President and current presidential candidate Joe Biden in particular. And Trump is accused of trying to get these investigations by withholding $391 million from the government of Ukraine. He's also accused of not scheduling a meeting at the White House that the Ukrainian president wanted unless the investigations were announced. Not actually completed, but just announced. But it's really the $391 million that's at the center of all of this. But in order to really understand this impeachment, it's crucial to understand why the corporate elite who control our government give a hot damn about Ukraine in the first place. Big picture, Ukraine is currently a main battleground in our country's 70-year-plus effort to get the entire world to operate under the rules dictated by the World Trade System. There are a lot of international organizations that serve the World Trade System. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and NATO, which is the military alliance we created with our European partners after World War II, and which serves as the international military coalition that protects and expands this system. But to explain the idea behind this system, here's one of its biggest cheerleaders, Robert Kagan. Robert Kagan is a co-founder of the warmongering Project for a New American Century. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a former member of the Reagan administration, and he's a writer who pushed hard for the overthrow of Iraq. He's one of the most passionate cheerleaders for the world order that I referred to as the World Trade System. And here he is explaining to Congress in 2016 why the corporate elite think the World Trade System is a noble cause worth pursuing, no matter how many people have to die in that pursuit.
But as we look across the whole panoply of threats that we face in the world, I worry that it's too easy to lose sight of what, to my mind, represent the greatest threats that we face over the medium and long term, and possibly even sooner than we may think. And that is the threat posed by the two great powers in the international system, the two great revisionist powers in the international system, Russia and China. Because what they threaten is something that is in a way more profound, which is this world order that the United States created after the end of World War II. A global security order, a global economic order, and a global political order. This is not something the United States did as a favor to the rest of the world. It's not something we did out of an act of generosity, although by historical terms it was a rather remarkable act of generosity. It was done based on what Americans learned in the first half of the 20th century, which was that if there was not a power, whether it was Britain or, as it turned out, it had to be the United States, willing and able to maintain this kind of decent world order, you did not have some smooth ride into something else. What you had was catastrophe. What you had was the rise of aggressive powers, the rise of hostile powers that were hostile to liberal values. We all know what happened with two world wars in the first half of the 20th century, and what those who were present at the creation, so to speak, after World War II wanted to create was an international system that would not permit those kinds of horrors to be repeated.
When you see the world like Robert Kagan and other world order true believers, all of their wars are necessary bumps on the road to peace. Peace that will only be achieved when the entire world is operating under their rules. And Ukraine is one of those peace bumps. Ukraine is a country that sits between Europe and Russia. It's Russia's next door neighbor. And it serves as an important transportation hub for gas that flows from Russia to Europe. In fact, here's a bit of perspective provided during the November 21st impeachment hearing with Dr. Fiona Hill, who's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations who worked as an intelligence analyst for George W. Bush and Obama before joining Trump's national security staff. Here she is talking about Ukraine's energy situation.
And one of Ukraine's Achilles heel, in addition to its military disadvantage with Russia is in fact energy. Ukraine remains for now the main transit point for Russian oil and gas and pipelines to Europe. And this has been manipulated repeatedly, especially since 2006, by the Russian government. And in fact, I mean, many of you here will remember in the Reagan era, there was a huge dispute between the United States and Europe about whether it made sense for Europe to build pipelines from the then Soviet Union to bring gas to European markets.
I didn't know that constructing the pipelines through Ukraine was controversial in the Reagan administration, or that the pipelines were built so recently. I mean, it makes sense, but I was in grade school. I had no idea. And that was one of many moments in the impeachment hearings when I heard bits of history that I was unaware of. But the point is that those pipelines did get built, a lot of them. And then it was discovered that Ukraine itself has quite a bit of natural gas just sitting there ready to be fracked and profited from. The multinationals, they want that gas. And they also want access to Ukraine's agricultural riches. Ukraine itself is a prize in its own right. And so in November 2013, in the second half of the Obama administration, the government of Ukraine, led by then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, was negotiating an agreement that would have integrated the Ukrainians into the World Trade System. It would have delivered the prize via a trade agreement with the European Union. At the time, Ukraine needed money, and the deal would have allowed Ukraine to get money from the International Monetary Fund in return for Ukraine changing their economic laws to match the World Trade System laws and allow multinationals to have access to Ukrainian resources, because privatization of resources is a main feature of World Trade System economic policy. The so-called trade agreement also would have started Ukraine on a path towards joining NATO, the military alliance created after World War II, which sure appears to be anti-Russia, especially lately. Russia didn't want this deal between Ukraine and the World Trade System that our elites control to happen. And so Russia offered Ukraine a different deal, $15 billion and a discount on natural gas, which was a deal that the president of Ukraine considered better for his country. In November of 2013, right before he was expected to sign the deal, making Ukraine an economic partner with Europe and the World Trade System, the president instead decided to partner with Russia. And our country responded by orchestrating the replacement of the Ukrainian government. One of the most damning pieces of evidence that we have proving that the Obama administration was involved in the Ukrainian coup is that weeks before the coup took place, a phone call was leaked during which Obama's ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, and Obama's Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, who also happens to be Robert World Order Kagan's wife. Well, Jeffrey Pyatt and Victoria Nuland were caught planning who would be installed in the new Ukrainian government, a man named Arseny Yatsenyuk, nicknamed Yats, who, sure as was in fact put in power in Ukraine right after the coup, and who did sign that agreement with the World Trade System countries, who took money from the International Monetary Fund, and who started the reforms that changed the Ukrainian laws to the World Trade System's liking. Here's a clip from that phone call leaked before the coup with the State Department's Victoria Nuland and Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt.
Good. So I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, what in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
And to seal the coup deal, another well-known member of the Obama administration was sent in to get the deets to stick.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
Vice President Joe Biden was a key player in the replacement of the Ukrainian government in February 2014. Considering that defending Biden's honor is a key reason for President Trump's impeachment, Biden's role as coup maestro is worth keeping in mind. Anyway, after the coup was complete on March 1st, 2014, Russia then invaded and took possession of a peninsula off the southern coast of Ukraine called Crimea. Russia was renting land on Crimea from the Yanukovych government to house its Black Sea Fleet. And by taking control of this land away from the new coup-installed government, Russia was able to maintain control of an important part of their own military. They also took possession of a decent portion of Ukraine's unfracked natural gas locked up underneath Crimea's soil. Regardless, Crimea is now Russia. But it's been official U.S. policy, as I have read in law after law after law in the last 5 years, to deny this reality. There is a bipartisan consensus among the U.S. warmongering elite that Russia shall never be allowed to keep Crimea in peace. And so keeping that history in mind, the coup and the invasion of Crimea by Russia were brought up over and over again in the impeachment hearings. But casual impeachment observers might not have recognized that story based on the way it's described by DC insiders. Here's David Holmes, counselor for political affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, in Ukraine, testifying at the impeachment hearing on November 21st.
Today, this very day, marks exactly 6 years since throngs of pro-Western Ukrainians spontaneously gathered on Kiev's Independence Square to launch what became known as the Revolution of Dignity. While the protests began in opposition to a turn towards Russia and away from the West, they expanded over 3 months to reject the entire corrupt, repressive system that had been sustained by Russian influence in the country. Those events were followed by Russia's occupation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, an invasion of Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, and an ensuing war that to date has cost almost 14,000 lives.
Coup, revolution of dignity, same thing. George Orwell couldn't have scripted it better. And since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, the Civil War has been branded as an act of Russian aggression, as if they started the whole thing, invading Crimea and some land on the eastern side of Ukraine called the Donbas, completely out of nowhere. But the timeline proves this to be bullshit. Crimea was invaded the day after Yats, the guy picked by the State Department to govern Ukraine, took power. Russia didn't start this. Obama and Biden did by meddling in Ukraine's government, by overthrowing the fucking thing. And the warmongers within our government have been carefully repeating their Russian-blaming talking points ever since. And this is all very deliberate. So here's Kurt Volker. Kurt Volker started his career as a CIA analyst during the Reagan administration, and then he joined the State Department during the George W. Bush administration as the number 2 official in charge of European affairs, with particular responsibility for NATO, eventually becoming George W. Bush's ambassador to NATO. Then Volker spent the first half of the Obama years in the private sector as a director of something called the Wall Street Fund, which stopped being a fund for some reason in the beginning of the Trump years. In the second half of the Obama years, Volker was also on the board of another Wall Street fund called the CG Core Balanced Fund. Also during the Obama years, Volker worked for lobbying firm BGR Group, which represents Raytheon, the company that makes Javelin anti-tank missiles, which are being purchased with our tax money and Ukraine's money for Ukraine to use against pro-Russia Ukrainians in their civil war. And remember that, you'll hear the word Javelin again. And overlapping much of this since 2012, Volker has been an executive director at the McCain Institute, named after John McCain, the now deceased former senator who has been quoted many times on this podcast professing his devotion to the world order, and who spoke on the stage at the so-called spontaneous protests during the Revolution of Dignity, the coup, in Ukraine, with John McCain telling the crowd that their future is with Europe. The reason Kurt Volker testified in November to the House Select Committee on Intelligence is that he was appointed special envoy to Ukraine by then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in 2017. And so here's some of his testimony from November 19th.
We changed the language commonly used to describe Russia's aggression. I was the administration's most outspoken public figure highlighting Russia's invasion and occupation of parts of Ukraine, calling out Russia's responsibility to end the war.
They choose their words carefully when they described what has happened in Ukraine, because the result has been, as you heard, a horrific war on the Ukraine-Russia border that has killed thousands of people. And this would be hard to justify to basic Americans if we were to be told what happened without the propaganda and spin. Especially since the Iraq War, we're not big fans here in America, at least in peasant America, of our tax money and friends and family members being used to overthrow governments, which is why we're systematically lied to. Our involvement in Ukraine has to be sold as a case of Russia gone wild. But the main reasons for our involvement in the replacement of Ukraine's government and the sustainment of the new government ever since have been articulated for those that are paying attention. For example, this is former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, who was number 2 to Victoria Nuland in the State Department when the coup was being planned in 2013, and who then took Jeffrey Pyatt's job as Ukraine ambassador after he left. Yovanovitch served as ambassador to Ukraine until she was transferred on May 20th of this year. Because, by the way, while the media has been saying over and over again that she was fired, she's still currently working at the State Department. She's working at a university, but she's paid by the State Department. She was transferred. She didn't lose her job. But the main point is that she worked for Victoria Nuland. She's been all up in the coup since the beginning, and here's what she said about her role in Ukraine during the Trump years.
I worked to advance U.S. policy, fully embraced by Democrats and Republicans alike, to help Ukraine become a stable and independent democratic state with a market economy integrated into Europe.
And she continued.
As critical as the war against Russia is, Ukraine's struggling democracy has an equally important challenge, battling the Soviet legacy of corruption which has pervaded Ukraine's government. Corruption makes Ukraine's leaders ever vulnerable to Russia, and the Ukrainian people understand that. That's why they launched the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, demanding to be a part of Europe, demanding the transformation of the system, demanding to live under the rule of law. Ukrainians wanted the law to apply equally to all people, whether the individual in question is the president or any other citizen. It was a question of fairness, of dignity. Here again, there is a coincidence of interests. Corrupt leaders are inherently less trustworthy, while an honest and accountable Ukrainian leadership makes a U.S.-Ukrainian partnership more reliable and more valuable to the United States. A level playing field in this strategically located country, bordering 4 NATO allies, creates an environment in which U.S. business can more easily trade, invest, and profit.
So the regime changers in our government want Ukraine to be a market economy, which will allow multinationals to trade, invest, and profit. But there's a war aspect to our involvement in Ukraine as well. As I documented when it happened on this very podcast in 2014 in episodes number 67, What Do We Want in Ukraine, and number 68, Ukraine Aid Bill. And by the way, there's a bunch of episodes that I've done on this in the past, and I've included all of them in the show notes for you. But back in 2014, Congress and the Obama administration had a bill signed into law within 5 weeks of the coup that sent Ukraine $150 million that was funneled to non-governmental organizations for, quote, election monitoring, unquote. Also for, quote, diversifying Ukraine's economy, trade, and energy supplies, unquote, at every level of government. It was also for media programs, and it was for support of economic reforms, of course, which are the strings attached to our aid that force Ukraine to change their laws to make them more friendly to multinationals. The largest chunk of the money went for war materials, though, giving equipment and military training to Ukrainian locals. And that was just the first of many Ukraine aid bills. Ever since that first law was signed in April of 2014, every National Defense Authorization Act and defense funding law has provided more and more money and weapons and military training to the Ukrainians, to the point that the military aid funnels have expanded quite a bit. So here's William Taylor. He's one of the first 2 witnesses to testify in the public impeachment hearings. And his bio consists of one regime change after another. First, William Taylor was in charge of Afghanistan policy in 2003 for the George W. Bush administration during their attempt to control the Afghanistan government in the wake of 9/11. Taylor then moved to Iraq in 2004 and was put in charge of reconstruction management. So he's the guy that gave out the contracts in Iraq after the government overthrow. He doled out the money, which is a role that they don't just give to anybody. Then he became ambassador to Ukraine during the George W. Bush administration, and in that role, in 2008, he made headlines when he openly pushed W. Bush to give Ukraine the chance to join NATO, the military alliance. He ultimately failed during the W. Bush years to absorb Russia's next-door neighbor into an anti-Russia military alliance, but he wasn't done yet. After W. Bush moved on to paint weird pictures of his toes and Barack Obama became the president, William Taylor was appointed to, get this, quote, special coordinator for Middle East transitions, unquote, from September 2011 through 2013. So first of all, that's the thing. We have an office for Middle East transitions. Our government isn't even trying to hide our meddling in other countries' affairs anymore. They name whole departments after it. But as far as Taylor is concerned, he coordinated assistance to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, a country everybody knows that Obama and Hillary overthrew in 2011, and he coordinated assistance to Syria, a country that they tried to overthrow until Russia stepped in and stopped it. And so flash forward to the Trump administration after Marie Yovanovitch was transferred out of Ukraine. William Taylor was then asked to serve as ambassador to Ukraine again, and he's been acting Ukraine ambassador since June of this year. And so here he is, the warmonger himself, giving some specifics about what our military aid is paying for in Ukraine.
Since 2014, you and Congress have provided over $1.6 billion in military assistance to Ukraine. The security assistance provides small unit training at an Army base near Lviv in the western of the country. It provides ambulances, night vision devices, communications equipment, counter-battery radar, Navy ships, and finally, weapons. This security assistance demonstrates our commitment to resist aggression and defend freedom.
And he continued with an update on the Trump years.
During the 2014 to 2016 period, I was serving outside of government and joined two other former ambassadors to Ukraine in urging the Obama administration officials at the State Department, Defense Department, and other agencies to provide lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine in order to deter further Russian aggression. I also supported much stronger sanctions on Russia. I was pleased when the Trump administration provided Javelin anti-tank missiles and enacted stronger sanctions.
So Trump pleased the career warmongers by providing weapons that were even more deadly than what the Obama administration would provide to its puppet government in Ukraine. And so what started with $150 million in 2014 has become billions. And there are now 3 ways Congress is funneling military aid to Ukraine, or at least 3 ways that they're openly funneling military aid to Ukraine. And so here's Laura Cooper. She joined the Defense Department early in the George W. Bush administration. She was actually in the Pentagon on 9/11, and she's served various positions in the Defense Department ever since. Right now, she is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. And here she is testifying on November 20th. And by the way, they do a lot of abbreviations in the Department of Defense. So DOD stands for Department of Defense, and FMF stands for Foreign Military Finance, which is a State Department fund that funnels billions of our tax money to governments around the world for their militaries.
There are 3 separate pieces to our overall ability to provide equipment to the Ukrainian armed forces. The first is the Foreign Military Finance System, which is a State Department authority, and countries around the world have this authority. That authority is used for some of the training and equipment. There's also the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. That's a DoD authority. Unlike the state authority, the DoD authority is only a 1-year authority. And then third, there's the opportunity for defense sales. And that is something that we're working with the Ukrainians on now so that they can actually purchase U.S. equipment. But the Javelin specifically was provided under FMF initially, and now the Ukrainians are interested in the purchase of Javelin.
And here's how the World Order folks describe that aid and explain its ultimate purpose. Here's George Kent, the other of the first 2 witnesses to testify. George Kent was a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who, aside from being Mika's dad, was also one of the most influential World Order zealots in the world. His student, George Kent, was appointed after the coup by the Obama administration to be the Deputy Chief of Mission in Ukraine. And now George Kent is currently serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the European and Eurasian Bureau at the U.S. Department of State, which is the same part of the State Department where coup orchestrator Victoria Nuland was positioned when she arranged for President Yanukovych to be thrown out on his Russia-loving ass. Here's George Kent testifying during the impeachment inquiry on November 13th.
Ukraine's Popular Revolution of Dignity in 2014 forced a corrupt, pro-Russian leadership to flee to Moscow. After that, Russia invaded Ukraine, occupying 7% of its territory roughly equivalent to the size of Texas for the United States. At that time, Ukraine's state institutions were on the verge of collapse. Ukrainian civil society answered the challenge. They formed volunteer battalions of citizens, including technology professionals and medics. They crowdsourced funding for their own weapons, body armor, and supplies. They were the 21st century Ukrainian equivalent of our own Minutemen of 1776, buying time for a regular army to reconstitute. Since then, more than 13,000 Ukrainians have died on Ukrainian soil defending their territorial integrity and sovereignty from Russian aggression. America's support in Ukraine's own de facto war of independence has been critical in this regard. By analogy, the American colonies may not have prevailed against the British imperial might without the help of transatlantic friends after 1776. In an echo of Lafayette's organized assistance to General George Washington's Army and Admiral John Paul Jones's Navy, Congress has generously appropriated over $1.5 billion over the past 5 years in desperately needed trained and equipped security assistance to Ukraine. These funds increase Ukraine's strength and ability to fight Russian aggression. Ultimately, Ukraine is on a path to become a full security partner of the United States within NATO.
Imagine if Russia had a military alliance, then coordinated the overthrow of the Mexican government, and then openly declared its intention to include Mexico in its anti-USA military partnership. That's the equivalent of what a high-ranking member of the State Department just said our goal is in Ukraine, Russia's next-door neighbor. But it's actually not a fair comparison because that's not just us threatening Russia by expanding an anti-Russia military alliance right up to their doorstep. Here's William Taylor, key regime changer of the W. Bush years, with a big picture explanation to Congress about why we need to give money and weapons to Ukraine.
The whole notion of a rules-based order was being threatened by the Russians in Ukraine. So our security assistance was designed to support Ukraine. It was not just the United States. It was all of our allies.
So the point I'm making here is that when we think of Ukraine and our aid to Ukraine, this is a much bigger issue than just helping out a friendly country in need. The military aid that we have been providing for more than 5 years now serves to maintain a regime change that was orchestrated and supported by the United States and our NATO allies. It's a world order thing, and the people involved want that regime change to stick. And one of the most striking things to me as I watched over 40 hours of testimony in the House Select Committee on Intelligence, every minute of every hearing presenting the evidence against President Trump, was that every single person who testified wanted the military aid to go to Ukraine. In fact, they were all quite passionate about it. Now, you've already heard some of the witnesses profess their love for the Ukrainian cause and the need to keep the military aid flowing. And here's some more of them. So here's Defense Department longtimer Laura Cooper.
I have also supported a robust Ukrainian Ministry of Defense program of defense reform to ensure the long-term sustainability of U.S. investments and the transformation of the Ukrainian military from a Soviet model to a NATO interoperable force.
Here's Gordon Sondland. Gordon Sondland is the owner of Providence Hotels, which has 14 hotels, almost half of them in Portland, Oregon. And in addition to being a rich donor to arts, medical research, and charities all over Portland, Oregon, he's also a heavy donor to campaigns, mainly Republican campaigns, but some Democrats too. He donated significant sums of money to George W. Bush, John McCain, and he even says he was a member of Mitt Romney's presidential transition team on one of his LinkedIn profiles. He actually has 3 LinkedIn profiles. In the run-up to the 2016 election, Gordon Sondland was originally betting on Jeb Bush, hoping to get an ambassadorship in return for his generosity. But after Jeb Bush dropped out of the race, Sondland's most famous donation was $1 million he gave to Donald Trump's inauguration, funneling the money through 4 of his companies. And he's now Trump's U.S. ambassador to the European Union. And here he is on November 20th.
I was adamantly opposed to any suspension of aid, as the Ukrainians needed those funds to fight against Russian aggression.
And here's Tim Morrison. Tim Morrison was the policy director for the House Committee on Armed Services during the Republicans' reign during the Obama years. Now that it's the Trump years, he joined Trump's National Security Council in July 2018 and was there until he resigned on Halloween, just one day before his first behind-closed-doors testimony in the impeachment inquiry. Now he's a consultant, which means he's a person who makes loads of money in the private sector, helping multinationals profit around the world. And here's what he said during the impeachment inquiry.
I continue to believe Ukraine is on the front lines of a strategic competition between the West and Vladimir Putin's revanchist Russia. Russia is a failing power, but it is still a dangerous one. The United States aids Ukraine and her people so they can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here. Support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty has been a bipartisan objective since Russia's military invasion in 2014. It must continue to be.
And here's David Holmes. He joined the State Department in 2002 during the George W. Bush administration. There's a lot of people that are in power now from the George W. Bush administration. David Holmes is one of them. And he's served various positions in the State Department ever since. And here he is testifying as a senior staffer at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine.
Now is not the time to retreat from our relationship with Ukraine, but rather to double down on it.
Every single witness, every single one of them, was a passionate supporter of policy that continues to funnel our tax money to the Ukraine government side of the civil war. In fact, William Taylor, the high-ranking regime changer from the W. Bush years, who then did Middle East transitions in the Obama years, well, he was so passionate about it that he conditioned his service as Ukraine ambassador on this policy continuing.
I could be effective only if the U.S. policy of strong support for Ukraine, strong diplomatic support, along with robust security, economic, and technical assistance were to continue.
So one thing that is crystal clear is that the policy of giving our money and weapons to the Ukrainian government was popular among the witnesses in the impeachment hearings. Popular as in unanimous. Which is notable because the Trump administration is officially, on paper, in action, questioning this very popular aid to Ukraine. And it's not just Ukraine aid, it's all foreign aid. So this next clip is of David Hale. He's been in the government since the oh-so-appropriate year of 1984. Early in his career, he was executive assistant for Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who to this day remains one of the top world order-furthering regime changers. After leaving Madeleine's side, David Hale became director for Israel-Palestinian affairs in the early W. Bush years and was eventually promoted by the W. administration to be one of the deputy assistant secretaries of state. During the Obama years, David Hale was the special envoy for Middle East peace right after we overthrew Libya. And then he was ambassador to Lebanon and ambassador to Pakistan, where he remained until he became Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs on August 30th, 2018. And here is David Hale talking to Representative John Ratcliffe of Texas.
We've often heard at the State Department that the President of the United States wants to make sure that foreign assistance is reviewed scrupulously to make sure that it's truly in U.S. national interests and that we evaluate it continuously so that it meets certain criteria that the President's established.
And since his election, is it fair to say that President Trump has looked to overhaul how foreign aid is distributed?
Yes, the NSC launched a foreign assistance review process sometime, I think it was late August or early September 2018.
So they've been doing a review of foreign assistance, which started right before the end of the last fiscal year. And just a reminder, fiscal years end on September 30th. And so that's the most important deadline for governing because it's the day the money resets. And so when it comes to money that's appropriated, funded 1 year at a time, like the Defense Department money for Ukraine, if it's not spent by September 30th, it's basically forfeited. That's important in this story. And speaking of the budget, I think it's also worth knowing that I've been reading the government funding laws for years. In fact, I did a whole episode where I compared what the Trump administration requested to what Congress actually appropriated in 2018. And in that episode, I discovered that the Trump administration requested to eliminate all $150 million from the Defense Department's Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, but Congress increased it to $200 million. The Trump administration also requested drastic cuts to the State Department foreign aid funds. Particularly, they requested the complete elimination of the Assistance for Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia account, which funnels millions of dollars to Ukraine. Now, that was 2018. In 2019, which is the funding year at the center of this impeachment, Congress, through the State Department, appropriated at least $445 million to Ukraine, funneled through 5 funds, with the largest chunk of that money, again, coming from the Assistance for Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia account. And I say at least because there's all kinds of other funds that can be used by the State Department in particular to funnel money to countries around the world. But just like in 2018, the Trump administration requested $0 for the Assistance for Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia account. And not just in 2019, they did that for 2020 too. And that is the fund that provides the largest chunk of State Department money to Ukraine. And then on top of that, the rest of the money at the center of this impeachment is $250 million from the Defense Department. The Trump administration, just like in 2018, requested $0 for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. But Congress, instead of zeroing it out, increased the funding again from $200 to $250 million. That's the $250 million that's at the heart of this whole impeachment inquiry. And now that we have the 2020 funding, it was finished the day before the impeachment, we know that the Trump administration, for the third year in a row, requested $0 for the Defense Department's Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. But what's different this time with the 2020 funding is that Congress granted the Trump administration's wish to kill the funding. There is no 2020 funding for that Defense Department account, which means that the $250 million from 2019 was the last chunk of defense money that's going to go towards maintaining that regime change, which might explain why this 2019 funding was so important to the regime changers. The State Department funding, though, remains pretty much the same for 2020. The State Department will be funneling at least $448 million of our tax money to Ukraine in 2020. The main point here, though, is that there is evidence on paper spanning 3 fiscal years that the Trump administration didn't want to provide the aid to Ukraine as a matter of official policy, which is something to keep in mind as we examine the possible reasons for a hold on this very aid. Another thing to keep in mind is this bit of information that I didn't know. Ukraine was not the only country that has had aid withheld recently. Here's David Hale of the State Department answering questions posed by Representative John Ratcliffe of Texas.
In the past year, Ukraine was not the only country to have aid withheld from it. Is that correct?
Correct.
In the past year, was aid withheld from Pakistan?
Yes, sir.
Why was aid withheld from Pakistan?
Because of unhappiness over the policies and behavior of the Pakistani government toward certain proxy groups that were involved in conflicts with the United States.
And in the past year, was aid also withheld from Honduras?
Aid was withheld from the 3 states in northern Central America, yes.
In the past year, was aid withheld from Lebanon?
Yes, sir.
And when aid was first withheld from Lebanon, were you given a reason why it was withheld?
No.
So having no explanation for why aid is being withheld is not uncommon.
I would say it is not the normal way that we function.
But does happen?
It does happen.
And is it true that when aid was being withheld from Lebanon, that was at the same time aid was being withheld from Ukraine?
Correct, sir.
And you've testified that the aid to Lebanon still hasn't been released. Is that right?
That is correct.
All right.
So Ukraine wasn't the only country to have money withheld from it by the Trump administration. But Ukraine is the center of the impeachment, so let's take a look at what happened in detail in Ukraine in 2019. Because 2019 was no ordinary year in Ukraine. Between the time that the Ukraine war money was appropriated, the Defense Department funding was done on time, but it was late for the State Department, which wasn't funded until the end of Trump's border wall tantrum shutdown on January 25th. You know, it seems so long ago, but the longest shutdown in U.S. history was this year. That was 2019. But between the time that the 2019 funding was finally approved by Congress and the time the money was transferred, a new government took control in Ukraine. One that appears to actually have been democratically elected with 73% of the vote. On April 21st, Ukrainian voters got to choose between the president who's been ruling pretty much since the coup, Petro Poroshenko, and an actor who played a president on Ukrainian television, Volodymyr Zelensky. And they chose the comedian, which is kind of the most American thing they could do, electing a TV star as president. But the Ukrainians at least picked a TV star who's clearly intelligent and interested in doing the job. In an article by Franklin Foer, which I included in the show notes for you about Zelensky, the author describes the kind of comedy that Zelensky produced and starred in. And it's like smart comedy. The descriptions seem more Jon Stewart than Jim Carrey. And the article talks about how Zelensky, as president, is aware and acknowledges his inexperience, and so he sits there and takes lots of notes in his meeting. He listens far more than he speaks. He learns on purpose. And policy-wise, there's much for the regime changers to like about this guy. Zelensky is pro-European. In fact, after the coup, his company donated $1 million in Ukrainian money to the military that we're creating for the Ukrainian government. During Zelensky's campaign, his campaign staff also had secretive meetings with U.S. diplomats and world bankers, like officials from the actual World Bank who, they're world bankers, but like the highest officials in the World Trade System. They were having sneaky meetings with Zelensky's team. And then the witnesses who testified in the impeachment hearings met Zelensky at his May 20th inauguration, and they were all impressed. So here's Gordon Sondland, who's the ambassador to the European Union.
During the Zelensky inauguration on May 20th, the U.S. delegation developed a very positive view of the Ukraine government. We were impressed by President Zelensky's desire to promote a stronger relationship with the United States. We admired his commitment to reform, and we were excited about the possibility of Ukraine making the changes necessary to support a greater Western economic investment. And we were excited that Ukraine might, after years and years of lip service, finally get serious about addressing its own well-known corruption problems.
That was Gordon Sondland, a person who is key to this story, so pay attention to that name. But he was part of the group of people that was sent to attend President Zelensky's inauguration. But that group was smaller than originally planned. Here's David Holmes. He's the staffer at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine who's been working at the State Department since the W. Bush years.
It quickly became clear that the White House was not prepared to show the level of support for the Zelensky administration that we had originally anticipated. In early May, Mr. Giuliani publicly alleged that Mr. Zelensky was, quote, surrounded by enemies of the U.S. president and canceled a visit to Ukraine. Shortly thereafter, we learned that Vice President Pence no longer planned to lead the presidential delegation to the inauguration. The White House then whittled down an initial proposed list for the official presidential delegation to the inauguration from over a dozen individuals to just 5. Secretary Perry as its head, Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations Kurt Volcker, representing the State Department, National Security Council Director Alex Vindman, representing the White House, Temporary Acting Chargé d'Affaires Joseph Pennington, representing the embassy, and Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland. While Ambassador Sondland's mandate as the accredited ambassador to the European Union did not cover individual member states, let alone non-member countries like Ukraine, he made clear that he had direct and frequent access to President Trump and Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, and portrayed himself as the conduit to the President and Mr. Mulvaney for this group. Secretary Perry, Ambassador Sondland, and Ambassador Volcker later styled themselves the Three Amigos and made clear they would take the lead on coordinating our policy and engagement with the Zelensky administration.
So Zelensky's May 20th inauguration delegation was led by Energy Secretary Rick Perry and included 3 people who testified in the impeachment hearings, Kurt Volcker, Alex Vindman, and Gordon Sondland. And as you heard Sondland testify, the people at the meeting were impressed with Zelensky, and they tried to tell that to President Trump. Here's Kurt Volcker, the spook who started his regime-changing career at the CIA during the Reagan years, and then went big banker before leading the McCain Institute and becoming special envoy to Ukraine, appointed by ExxonMobil's ex-CEO turned Secretary of State Rex Tillerson.
The problem was that despite the unanimous positive assessment and recommendations of those of us who were part of the U.S. presidential delegation that attended the inauguration of President Zelensky, President Trump was receiving a different negative narrative about Ukraine and President Zelensky. That narrative was fueled by accusations from Ukraine's then Prosecutor General and conveyed to the president by former Mayor Rudy Giuliani. As I previously told this committee, I became aware of the negative impact this was having on our policy efforts when 4 of us, who were part of the presidential delegation to the inauguration, met as a group with President Trump on May 23rd. We stressed our finding that President Zelensky represented the best chance for getting Ukraine out of the mire of corruption it had been in for over 20 years. We urged him to invite President Zelensky to the White House. The president was very skeptical. Given Ukraine's history of corruption, that's understandable. He said that Ukraine was a corrupt country full of terrible people. He said, they tried to take me down. In the course of that conversation, he referenced conversations with Mayor Giuliani. It was clear to me that despite the positive news and recommendations being conveyed by this official delegation about the new president, President Trump had a deeply rooted negative view on Ukraine rooted in the past. He was receiving other information from other sources, including Mayor Giuliani, that was more negative, causing him to retain this negative view. Within a few days, on May 29th, President Trump indeed signed the congratulatory letter to President Zelensky, which included an invitation to the president to visit him at the White House. However, more than 4 weeks passed, and we could not nail down a date for the meeting. I came to believe that the president's long-held negative view toward Ukraine was causing hesitation in actually scheduling the meeting, much as we had seen in our Oval Office discussion.
The State Department's David Holmes notes that the meeting was tough to schedule from the beginning, too.
Within a week or two, it became apparent that the energy sector reforms, the commercial deals, and the anti-corruption efforts on which we were making progress were not making a dent in terms of persuading the White House to schedule a meeting between the presidents.
But was this delay in setting a White House meeting date definitely a Trump order? Well, here's David Holmes again.
We became concerned that even if a meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky could occur, it would not go well. And I discussed with embassy colleagues whether we should stop seeking a meeting altogether. While the White House visit was critical to the Zelensky administration, a visit that failed to send a clear and strong signal of support likely would be worse for President Zelensky than no visit at all.
So some in the State Department, not just Trump, had reservations about a White House meeting starting in May around Zelensky's inauguration. But back to President Trump, here's Gordon Sondland, the $1 million donor who was basically gifted the job of ambassador to the EU.
Unfortunately, President Trump was skeptical. He expressed concerns that the Ukrainian government was not serious about reform, and he even mentioned that Ukraine tried to take him down in the last election. In response to our persistent efforts in that meeting to change his views, President Trump directed us to, quote, talk with Rudy. We understood that talk with Rudy meant talk with Mr. Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer. Let me say again, we weren't happy with the president's directive to talk with Rudy. We did not want to involve Mr. Giuliani. I believed then, as I do now, that the men and women of the State Department, not the president's personal lawyer, should take responsibility for Ukraine matters. Nonetheless, based on the president's direction, we were faced with a choice. We could abandon the efforts to schedule the White House phone call and a White House visit between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, which was unquestionably in our foreign policy interest, or we could do as President Trump had directed and talk with Rudy. We chose the latter course, not because we liked it, but because it was the only constructive path open to us.
And so Kurt Volcker, CIA spook turned George W. Bush administration NATO cheerleader, turned banker, turned special envoy to Ukraine. Well, Kurt Volcker enlisted Rudy Giuliani, the New York City mayor on 9/11, who turned into a multinational business consultant for war mercenaries, pharmaceutical companies, and real estate moguls. And now he's real estate mogul turned President Donald Trump's personal lawyer. And here's Kurt Volcker explaining exactly what he did.
President Zelensky's senior aide, Andrei Yermak, approached me several days later to ask to be connected to Mayor Giuliani. I agreed to make that connection. I did so because I understood that the new Ukrainian leadership wanted to convince those, like Mayor Giuliani, who believed such a negative narrative about Ukraine, that times have changed, and that, under President Zelensky, Ukraine is worthy of U.S. support. Ukrainians believe that if they could get their own narrative across in a way that convinced Mayor Giuliani that they were serious about fighting corruption and advancing reform, Mayor Giuliani would convey that assessment to President Trump, thus correcting the previous negative narrative. That made sense to me, and I tried to be helpful. I made clear to the Ukrainians that Mayor Giuliani was a private citizen, the president's personal lawyer, and not representing the U.S. government. Likewise, in my conversations with Mayor Giuliani, I never considered him to be speaking on the president's behalf or giving instructions. Rather, the information flow was the other way, from Ukraine to Mayor Giuliani, in the hopes that this would clear up the information reaching President Trump.
Meanwhile, back in the actual government, The Department of Defense was completing their review of the military aid for Ukraine because the NDAA and 2019 funding law required an official review of the Ukrainian government's behavior before the checks could be written. This is Laura Cooper, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, who's been at the Defense Department since the early W. Bush years.
The National Defense Authorization Act requires the Department of Defense to certify defense reform progress to release half of the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, or USAI, funds, a provision we find very helpful. Based on recommendations from me and other key DoD advisors, the Department of Defense, in coordination with the Department of State, certified in May 2019 that Ukraine had, quote, taken substantial actions to make defense institutional reforms for the purposes of decreasing corruption, increasing accountability, and sustaining improvements of combat capability, unquote.
And so the money was allowed to be transferred starting around Zelensky's inauguration by the end of May. But, as we all know, it wasn't transferred. Here's Representative Mike Quigley of Illinois talking to Jennifer Williams, who started her career as a field representative for the W. Bush Cheney 2004 campaign, who became executive assistant to the chief of staff at the newly created Department of Homeland Security during the George W. Bush administration. She was later hired by the Obama administration State Department and is now Vice President Mike Pence's special advisor for Europe and Russia. And for reference, OMB stands for Office of Management and Budget. And so when you hear OMB, you can basically think White House because they're the budget dorks at the White House.
Ms. Williams, again, when did you first learn that the security assistance was being held up, the nearly $400 million that was referenced?
July 3rd.
And were you aware of any additional, or did you attend any additional meetings in which that military assistance being withheld was discussed?
I did. I attended meetings on July 23rd and July 26th where the security assistance hold was discussed. I believe it may have also been discussed on July 31st.
And at that point, did anyone provide a specific reason for the hold?
In those meetings, the OMB representative reported that the assistance was being held at the direction of the White House Chief of Staff.
And did they give reasons beyond that it was being withheld by the White House Chief of Staff?
Not specifically. The reason given was that there was an ongoing review whether the funding was still in line with administration priorities.
Did anyone in any of those meetings or in any other subsequent discussion you had discuss the legality of withholding that aid?
There were discussions, I believe, in the July 31st meeting and possibly prior as well in terms of Defense and State Department officials were looking into how they would handle a situation in which earmarked funding from Congress that was designated for Ukraine would be resolved if the funding continued to be held as we approach the end of the fiscal year.
And from what you witnessed, did anybody in the national security community support withholding the assistance?
No.
So Vice President Mike Pence's advisor learned about the hold on July 3rd. That's the first date that the hold is mentioned. Laura Cooper, who's been in the Department of Defense since the W. Bush years, also had some testimony about July 3rd. And she uses a lot of abbreviations in this one. So CN stands for Congressional Notice, because the president needs to send a notice to Congress when the executive branch sends the aid checks. And FMF is Foreign Military Financing. That's the State Department chunk of the aid money.
On July 3rd at 4:23 p.m., they received an email from the State Department stating that they had heard that the CN is currently being blocked by OMB. This apparently refers to the congressional notification state would send for Ukraine FMF. I have no further information on this.
So July 3rd. Word gets out that the White House Office of Management and Budget was somehow delaying the checks for Ukrainian weapons. And the central question remains, why? Representative Adam Schiff, the chairman of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, asked Jennifer Williams, who's Vice President Mike Pence's special advisor, and Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman, who is an Iraq War veteran who was on Trump's National Security Council, that very question.
Let me turn, if I can, to the hold on security assistance, which I think you both testified you learned about in early July. Am I correct that neither of you were provided with a reason for why the president put a hold on security assistance to Ukraine?
My understanding was that OMB was reviewing the assistance to ensure it was in line with administration priorities, but it was not made more specific than that.
Colonel Vindman?
That is consistent. The review was to ensure it remained consistent with administration policies.
And William Taylor, current ambassador to Ukraine, who's been on team regime change since the early W. Bush years, he at least confirmed exactly who ordered that review.
On July 9th, in a phone call with then Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs Fiona Hill and Director of European Affairs Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman at the NSC, they tried to assure me that they were not aware of any official change in U.S. policy towards Ukraine, OMB's announcement notwithstanding. They did confirm that the hold on security assistance for Ukraine came from Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, who maintained a skeptical view of Ukraine.
And Mick Mulvaney has refused to testify, even though he was sent a subpoena. And one of the reasons he refused to testify is that President Trump has instructed everyone to refuse to cooperate with the impeachment inquiry, claiming that they all have absolute immunity, which is likely absolute horseshit. The courts would have been able to rule on the legality of Mulvaney's refusal to appear by mid-December, at the earliest. But now that impeachment has moved forward, those court cases, I honestly don't know what happens to those court cases, to tell you the truth. But Mick Mulvaney did give a press conference on October 17th, a month before the public impeachment hearings. And here's why he said they put the hold on the money and the weapons.
You were directly involved in the decision to withhold funding from Ukraine. Can you explain to us now definitively why? Why was funding withheld?
Sure. Let's deal with the second one first, which is, look, it should come as no surprise to anybody. The last time I was up here, I haven't done this since I was chief of staff, right? Last time I was up here, some of you folks remember, it was for the budget briefings, right? And one of the questions y'all always ask me about the budget is, what are y'all doing to the foreign aid budget? Because we absolutely gutted it, right? President Trump is not a big fan of foreign aid. Never has been, still isn't. Doesn't like spending money overseas, especially when it's poorly spent. And that is exactly what drove this decision. I've been in the office a couple times with him talking about this. He said, look, Mick, this is a corrupt place. Everybody knows it's a corrupt place. By the way, put this in context. This is on the heels of what happened in Puerto Rico, when we took a lot of heat for not wanting to give a bunch of aid to Puerto Rico because we thought that place was corrupt. And by the way, it turns out we were right. All right, so put that as your context. He's like, look, this is a corrupt place. I don't want to send them a bunch of money and have them waste it, have them spend it, have them use it to line their own pockets. Plus, I'm not sure that the other European countries are helping them out either. So we actually looked at that during that time before when we cut the money off before the money actually flowed, because the money flowed by the end of the fiscal year. We actually did an analysis of what other countries were doing in terms of supporting Ukraine. And what we found out was that, and I can't remember if it's $0 or near $0 from any European countries for lethal aid. You've heard the president say this, that we give them tanks and the other countries give them pillows. That's absolutely right. That as vocal as the Europeans are about supporting Ukraine, they are really, really stingy when it comes to lethal aid. And they weren't helping Ukraine, and that still to this day are not. And the president did not like that. I know it was a long answer to your question, but I'm still going. So those were the driving factors. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely, no question about that. But that's it, and that's why we held up the money.
So they did a review. Quite a few people have testified to that, and you just heard it from Mick Mulvaney, to see how much everyone was giving to Ukraine. And the results of that review, there was some testimony about those results, and I found those results definitely worth hearing. So here's David Holmes, who's one of the big fish at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine.
The United States has provided combined civilian and military assistance to Ukraine since 2014 of about $3 billion, plus two $1 billion loan guarantees. Those get paid back largely. So just over $3 billion. The Europeans, at the level of the European Union plus the member states combined since 2014, my understanding, have provided a combined $12 billion to Ukraine.
And so even if what Mick Mulvaney in that press conference says is true, and I don't know if it is, that Europe isn't providing any lethal aid, $12 billion in pillows and shit is still a lot of money. But I'd also like to take a minute to marinate on the results of our contributions too. Already in this episode, you've heard the common wisdom about the amount of aid that we've given to Ukraine. William Taylor and George Kent have both told us that it's $1.5 billion. But Holmes said that the review showed that we've given double that, $3 billion plus $3 billion in loan guarantees. The Trump review showed that we've handed over much more than we've been commonly told. And that was the only mention of the review's conclusion, that we've given $3 billion plus $3 billion in loan guarantees instead of the $1.5 billion. And this info nugget was buried almost 5 hours into the last witness hearing. And so the country had tuned out of these boring hearings long before that moment. And I've seen exactly no one talk about this. But the Trump administration delayed $391 billion and is being impeached for it. So is withholding the aid a crime? Representative Mike Quigley of Illinois questioned Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who was on the National Security Council. And just so you know, PCC stands for Policy Coordination Committee. It's a part of the National Security Council.
Anyone into your understanding raised the legality of withholding this assistance?
It was raised on several occasions.
And who raised those concerns?
Following the July 18th sub-PCC, which is, again, what I coordinate, or what I convene at my level, there was a July 23rd PCC that would have been conducted by Mr. Morrison. There were questions raised on as to the legality of the hold. Over the subsequent week, the issue was analyzed, and during the July 26th deputies, so the deputies from all the departments and agencies, there was a opinion rendered that it was legal to put the hold.
It was, excuse me?
There was an opinion rendered that it was okay to that the hold was legal.
So withholding aid is not a crime. But to be fair, no one really seems to be claiming that it is. Instead, the sin being alleged in the impeachment is that President Donald Trump ordered the aid withheld unless President Zelensky announced an investigation into Burisma, where the son of former Vice President Joe Biden got a job he wasn't qualified for, and where there might be closet-dwelling skeletons that would make the Biden family look bad. And because Biden has announced that he wants to be president, making him look bad is being spun as tantamount to interfering in our election, which is bullshit. It's interfering in a Democratic Party campaign. The election would be administrated no differently if Zelensky said words on CNN. But I digress. President Trump is being accused of conditioning war money upon President Zelensky doing what Trump wants. And I've been talking for over 7 years now about how one of the key strategies used by the World Trade System to get countries to change their laws is dangling aid money in return for those changes. Here's George Kent, student of World Trade System disciple Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was appointed to Ukraine the year after the coup by the Obama State Department, who remained there into the Trump years.
There are and always have been conditionality placed on our sovereign loan guarantees for Ukraine. Conditions include anti-corruption reforms, as well as meeting larger stability goals and social safety nets. The International Monetary Fund does the same thing. Congress and the executive branch work together to put conditionality on some security assistance in the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative.
And so it's not the existence of conditions on aid that's controversial. That's standard operating policy. It's what conditions were placed on the aid, if any. And so let's take a look at the timeline of events, and you can hear for yourself exactly what the testimony said. So again, there are two things that President Trump supposedly dangled in front of Ukraine to get an investigation announced: a White House meeting and $391 million from the Defense Department and the State Department. But it's really the money, because as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor said,
it's one thing to try to leverage a meeting in the White House. It's another thing, I thought, to leverage security assistance to a country at war, dependent on both the security assistance and the demonstration of support. It was much more alarming. The White House meeting was one thing, security assistance was much more alarming.
But in the days following the aid being put on hold on July 3rd, even though the aid was on hold, the conversation centered only upon the meeting. This was the case in a meeting hosted by then National Security Advisor John Bolton on July 10th. Here's Chairman Adam Schiff of California questioning National Security Council staffer Alex Vindman about that meeting headed by John Bolton on July 10th.
Colonel Vindman, you attended a meeting in John Bolton's office on July 10th where Ambassador Sondland interjected to respond to a question by senior Ukrainian officials about a White House visit. What did he say at that time?
To the best of my recollection, Ambassador Sondland said that in order to get a White House meeting, the Ukrainians would have to provide a deliverable, which is investigations, specific investigations.
And what was Ambassador Bolton's response or reaction to that comment?
We had not completed all of the agenda items, and we still had time for the meeting, and Ambassador Bolton abruptly ended the meeting.
And Representative Schiff's questions for Lieutenant Colonel Vindman continued.
Based on Ambassador Sondland's remark at the July 10th meeting, was it your clear understanding that the Ukrainians understood they had to commit to investigations President Trump wanted in order to get the White House meeting?
It may have not been entirely clear at that moment. Certainly, Ambassador Sondland was calling for these meetings, and he had stated that this was developed per a conversation with the Chief of Staff, Mr. Mick Mulvaney, but the connection to the president wasn't clear at that point.
Dr. Fiona Hill also attended the July 10th Bolton meeting. Fiona Hill is member of the Council on Foreign Relations who worked in the spook sector, the intelligence community, during the reigns of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. She was appointed to be a member of Trump's national security staff early in his administration, and she resigned 9 days after the Bolton meeting. But here's what she said in the impeachment hearing.
And so when I came in, Gordon Sondland was basically saying, well, look, we have a deal here that there will be a meeting. I have a deal here with Chief of Staff Mulvaney. There will be a meeting if the Ukrainians open up or announce these investigations into 2016 in Burisma. And I cut it off immediately there. Because by this point, having heard Mr. Giuliani over and over again on the television and all of the issues that he was asserting, by this point it was clear that Burisma was code for the Bidens, because Giuliani was laying it out there. I could see why Colonel Vindman was alarmed. And he said, this is inappropriate. We're the National Security Council. We can't be involved in this.
And so Gordon Sondland tied the White House meeting to investigations that Rudy Giuliani was pushing for in a July 10th meeting. And Fiona Hill gave Sondland a talking to after he did this. In this clip, and just for reference in this clip, Rada refers to the Ukraine version of Congress.
And that's when I pushed back on Ambassador Sondland and said, look, I know there's differences about when we should have this meeting. We're trying to figure out whether we should have it after the Ukrainian parliamentary elections, the Rada elections, which by that point I think had been set for July 21st. It must have been, because this is July 10th at this point. And Ambassador Bolton would like to wait until after that to basically see whether President Zelensky gets a majority in the parliament, which would enable him to form a cabinet, and then we can move forward.
And I feel like this is important information, that in the July 10th meeting, when Gordon Sondland tied the meeting to investigations, the National Security Council staff gave him shit because they wanted to delay the White House meeting. They wanted the White House meeting delayed until after the Ukrainian Congress's elections. And this is Representative Elise Stefanik of New York questioning Fiona Hill on the National Security Council's perspective on scheduling that White House meeting.
Dr. Hill, turning back to you, there's been discussion about the process of scheduling the meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump. And you testified that there was hesitancy to schedule this meeting until after the Ukrainian parliamentary elections. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And that's because there was speculation in all analytical circles, both in Ukraine and outside the Ukraine, that Zelensky might not be able to get the majority that he needed to form a cabinet, correct?
That is correct.
And you also testified that another aspect of the NSC's hesitancy to schedule this meeting was based on broader concerns related to Zelensky's ability to implement anti-corruption reforms. And this was in specific relation to Ukrainian oligarchs who basically were the owner of the TV company that Mr. Zelensky's program had been a part of. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so for those of you keeping track, that means that the State Department was expressing concerns about scheduling that White House meeting, afraid that it wouldn't go well, which could hurt Ukraine. And then the National Security Council wanted to delay the meeting until after July 21st, so as not to interfere in the Ukrainian congressional elections. Those are two reasons why the White House meeting between Trump and Zelensky could have been delayed past July 21st that don't have a damn thing to do with investigations. At this point, the investigations are one of 3 credible reasons for a delay in the White House meeting when President Trump spoke to President Zelensky on the now famous July 25th phone call, a phone call whose purpose was to congratulate President Zelensky on the favorable to him results of the July 21st Ukrainian congressional elections. So, the phone call. On the July 25th phone call, President Zelensky, the comedian, laid it on real thick, which we know because we have the transcript of the call. Zelensky starts the conversation with Trump by telling him that he won big in part because he learned from Trump. He told Trump that he wants to, quote, drain the swamp, unquote, in Ukraine. He actually used that phrase. And he told Trump, quote, you are a great teacher for us in that, unquote. Which now that I know that Zelensky is literally a comedian, I find that fucking hilarious. He was totally stroking Trump's massive ego. Trump then goes into a rant about how the United States is, quote, very, very good to Ukraine, unquote, and how the European countries, especially Germany, should be doing more for Ukraine. Zelensky agrees. He thanks President Trump for enforcing sanctions that are not being enforced by Europe. He also thanks Trump, quote, for your great support in the area of defense, unquote. He tells Trump that they want to, quote, continue to cooperate, unquote, and, quote, we are almost ready to buy more javelins from the United States for defense purposes, unquote. So to be clear, that's Ukraine's president promising to use Ukrainian money to purchase weapons. And here's Representative Will Hurd of Texas clarifying with the Defense Department's Laura Cooper the hold's effect on Zelensky's plan to buy more javelins, to buy more so-called lethal aid.
And there wasn't a hold put on purchasing of equipment. Is that correct?
Not to my understanding, no.
So right after President Zelensky says he intends to buy more javelins, Trump says the sentences that got him impeached. He said, quote, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation in Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people. The server. They say Ukraine has it. There are a lot of things that went on. The whole situation. I think you're surrounding yourself with some of the same people. I would like to have the Attorney General call you or your people, and I would like you to get to the bottom of it. As you saw yesterday, that whole nonsense ended with a very poor performance by a man named Robert Mueller. An incompetent performance, but they say a lot of it started with Ukraine. Whatever you can do, it's very important that you do it if that's possible, unquote. That's the Trump babble, word for word. President Zelensky then says he wants to cooperate in, quote, relations between the United States and Ukraine, unquote. He says he's in the process of switching the ambassador to the U.S. And then he tells Trump, quote, I will personally tell you that one of my assistants spoke with Mr. Giuliani just recently. And we are hoping very much that Mr. Giuliani will be able to travel to Ukraine and we will meet once he comes to Ukraine. I just want to assure you once again that you have nobody but friends around us, unquote. After a bit more ass kissing, Zelensky says, quote, in addition to that investigation, I guarantee as the president of Ukraine that all the investigations will be done openly and candidly, unquote. Trump responds, quote, good, because I heard you had a prosecutor who was very good and he was shut down, and that's really unfair. A lot of people are talking about that, the way they shut your very good prosecutor down, and you had some very bad people involved. Mr. Giuliani is a highly respected man. He was the mayor of New York City, a great mayor, and I would like him to call you. I will ask him to call you along with the Attorney General. Rudy very much knows what's happening, and he's a very capable guy. If you could speak to him, that would be great. The former ambassador from the United States, the woman, unquote, and there he's talking about Victoria Nuland's sidekick turned Ukraine ambassador, Marie Yovanovitch. Trump said she's, quote, bad news, and the people she was dealing with in Ukraine were bad news, so I just want to let you know that, unquote. And so basically, President Trump all over one of the leaders from the State Department. And he continued. He said, quote, the other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that, so whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me, unquote. And I went into this in the last impeachment episode that I did, I don't know, a month and a half ago. And I've played the Biden clip many, many times. But Vice President Joe Biden did tell the Council on Foreign Relations on video that he dangled $1 billion in loan guarantees in front of Ukraine. He threatened to cancel it on 6 hours' notice unless a prosecutor named Victor Shokin was fired. There was an open investigation into Burisma, where Hunter Biden was a board member at that time. And the new prosecutor, installed basically by Biden, did close that investigation. Apparently, Rudy Giuliani was talking to Viktor Shokin and wanted to bring him to the United States, but Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch refused Shokin's visa application. Giuliani talked shit on her on television, and she was transferred out of Ukraine. And there's more to the story than that. The details are fuzzy to me, but the thing is that they don't really matter because the president is allowed to switch his ambassadors. And so that's all I'm going to say about that. But Trump definitely did ask for an investigation into the Bidens in that phone call. The question is if he conditioned $391 million and or a White House meeting on that investigation being publicly announced on American television. And as far as the White House meeting is concerned, before he hung up, Trump told Zelensky, quote, "Whenever you would like to come to the White House, feel free to call. Give us a date and we'll work that out. I look forward to seeing you," unquote. Then Zelensky counter-invites Trump to Ukraine and suggests that they meet on September 1st in Poland. Zelensky, like a boss, then suggests that Trump's airplane is better than him, which is an ego-stroking master move. Trump then says, quote, "I look forward to seeing you in Washington and maybe in Poland," unquote, and then they exchange their bye-byes. Which is not much of a meeting dangle. No matter how many times I read this transcript, I can't see anything other than a straight-up invitation. There's no, "I'll meet you if," the if isn't there. And of course, I have the transcript linked for you in the show notes. You can read the whole thing yourself. It's only 5 pages, big font. And so read it and make up your own mind. The thing is, though, by the time this call took place on July 25th, the regime change true believers, they were already worried about the hold on the war money. Here's William Taylor responding to Daniel Goldman, who is the lawyer for the Democratic Party. But William Taylor, just a reminder, is the current ambassador to Ukraine who's been regime changing since the early W. Bush years.
Just so we're clear, Ambassador Taylor, before this July 25th call, President Trump had frozen the security assistance that Ukraine needed, and that the White House meeting was conditioned on Ukraine initiating this investigation, and that had been relayed to the Ukrainians. Is that an accurate state of play at this time?
That's an accurate state of play. I, at that point, had no indication that any discussion of the security assistance being subject to conditioned on investigations had taken place.
Right, but you understood that the White House meeting was.
That's correct.
But where did he get that from?
Mr. Goldman, what I can do here for you today is tell you what I heard from people. And in this case, it was what I heard from Ambassador Sondland.
And so did Ambassador Taylor ever talk to President Trump about this? This is Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio questioning William Taylor.
Ambassador, you weren't on the call, were you? You didn't listen on President Trump's call and President Zelensky's call?
I did not.
You've never talked with Chief of Staff Mulvaney?
I never did.
You never met the president?
That's correct.
So the Ukraine ambassador thought Ukrainians were told the White House meeting was conditioned on investigations. But he heard that from Gordon Sondland, not President Trump. But what about the military aid? Did the Ukrainians even know the aid was on hold on July 25th? This is Chairman Adam Schiff of California questioning Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor.
You've been asked, how could there be conditioning if the Ukrainians didn't know? But Ukrainians were told by Ambassador Sondland, were they not?
They were. They didn't know, as near as I can tell, the Ukrainians did not know about the hold on the phone call on July 25th. That's true. But they were told, as you said, Mr. Chairman, on the 1st of September.
Which is something that was backed up by multiple witnesses. Here's Kurt Volcker, the special envoy to Ukraine.
I believe the Ukrainians became aware of the hold on August 29th and not before. That date is the first time any of them asked me about the hold by forwarding an article that had been published in Politico.
So the ambassador to Ukraine and the special envoy to Ukraine both testified that the Ukrainians did not know that the $391 billion was being withheld until a month after the infamous phone call. And how can President Trump be dangling $391 billion over Zelensky's head on that phone call if Zelensky didn't know that the money wasn't already on its way? This is a really key question. The only testimony that in any way suggests that the Ukrainians asked about the aid before the hold became public, a month after the July 25th Trump-Zelensky call, was this testimony from Laura Cooper of the Defense Department.
Specifically, on the issue of Ukraine's knowledge of the hold or of Ukraine asking questions about possible issues with the flow of assistance, my staff showed me 2 unclassified emails that they received from the State Department. One was received on July 25th at 2:31 p.m. That email said that the Ukrainian Embassy and House Foreign Affairs Committee are asking about security assistance. The second email was received on July 25th at 4:25 p.m. That email said that the Hill knows about the FMF situation to an extent, and so does the Ukrainian Embassy. I did not receive either of these emails. My staff does not recall informing me about them, and I do not recall being made aware of their content at the time.
So the first email was from the State Department, not the Ukrainians, and it said, quote, the Ukrainian Embassy and House Foreign Affairs Committee are asking about security assistance, unquote. Well, what about the security assistance? It doesn't say. And the second email says that a reporter and the Ukrainian Embassy knows about the, quote, FMF situation, unquote. And that's the State Department portion of the aid, and we don't know what the situation is. And so when it came to the Defense Department portion of the money, the USAI, here's the communications the Defense Department had with the Ukrainians the same day as the famous phone call.
On July 25th, a member of my staff got a question from a Ukraine embassy contact asking what was going on with Ukraine security assistance. Because at that time, we did not know what the guidance was on USAI. The OMB notice of apportionment arrived that day, but this staff member did not find out about it until later. I was informed that the staff member told the Ukrainian official that we were moving forward on USAI, but recommended that the Ukraine embassy check in with state regarding the FMF.
So the day of the phone call, the Ukrainians were told that the money is coming, at least the Defense Department money, and they didn't know what was going on with the State Department, which makes sense because this is an email to the Defense Department, and that there was an OMB notice of apportionment that arrived that day, which is, it's an explanation of how they're going to divvy out the money. So on the day of the phone call, if I were a Ukrainian, I would think, based on these communications, that the aid was coming, wouldn't you? And then Representative John Ratcliffe of Texas followed up on all of this with Laura Cooper.
But you can't say one way or another whether the inquiries in these emails were about the hold. Is that fair?
I cannot say for certain.
All right. And you can't say one way or another whether the Ukrainians knew about the hold before August 28th, 2019, when it was reported in Politico, correct?
Sir, I can just tell you that it's the recollection of my staff that they likely knew, but no, I do not have a certain data point to offer you.
And that's the strongest evidence presented that President Zelensky knew there was a hold on the money when he talked to President Trump on July 25th. The day after the famous Trump-Zelensky phone call, Gordon Sondland, the hotel chain owner who gave Trump $1 million and became ambassador to the EU, was in Ukraine, and he met with President Zelensky. After the meeting, Gordon Sondland went out to lunch with David Holmes, the high-ranking staffer at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, who has been in the State Department since the early W. Bush years. And here's what Holmes told Congress happened that day at lunch. And strangely enough, this clip is going to reference a rapper named A$AP Rocky. A$AP Rocky is a 31-year-old rapper who in late June, while on tour in Europe, was involved in a fight in Stockholm, Sweden. The fight landed some dude in the hospital, and Swedish police arrested A$AP Rocky and his friends on July 3rd on assault charges. A$AP Rocky was then detained for nearly a month, the whole time promising that he was acting in self-defense. And then Kim Ye stepped in. Kanye West and Kim Kardashian West called their buddy Trump to ask him to get Kanye's rapper buddy out of the clink. And Trump did. He brought up A$AP Rocky in a phone call with the Swedish prime minister and later sent a hostage affairs envoy to watch over his trial in Stockholm. The court found A$AP Rocky guilty of assault, but ordered him to pay $1,300 in a fine to the victim instead of issuing prison time. A$AP Rocky paid the fine, was released, left the country, and pledged to never go back to Sweden again. And so when Holmes mentions the rapper, that's what he's talking about.
The four of us went to a nearby restaurant and sat on an outdoor terrace. I sat directly across from Ambassador Sondland, and the two staffers sat off to our sides. At first, the lunch was largely social, Ambassador Sondland selected a bottle of wine that he shared among the four of us, and we discussed topics such as marketing strategies for his hotel business. During the lunch, Ambassador Sondland said that he was going to call President Trump to give him an update. Ambassador Sondland placed a call on his mobile phone, and I heard him announce himself several times along the lines of Gordon Sondland holding for the president. It appeared that he was being transferred through several layers of switchboards and assistants, and I then noticed Ambassador Sondland's demeanor changed and understood that he had been connected to President Trump. While Ambassador Sondland's phone was not on speakerphone, I could hear the president's voice through the earpiece of the phone. The president's voice was loud and recognizable, and Ambassador Sondland held the phone away from his ear for a period of time, presumably because of the loud volume. I heard Ambassador Sondland greet the president and explain he was calling from Kyiv. I heard President Trump then clarify that Ambassador Sondland was in Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland replied, yes, he was in Ukraine, and went on to state that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass. I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do. Even though I did not take notes of these statements, I have a clear recollection that these statements were made. I believe that my colleagues who were sitting at the table also knew that Ambassador Sondland was speaking with the president. The conversation then shifted to Ambassador Sondland's efforts on behalf of the president to assist a rapper who was jailed in Sweden, and I could only hear Ambassador Sondland's side of the conversation. Ambassador Sondland told the president that the rapper was, quote, kind of effed there and should have pled guilty. He recommended that the president, quote, wait until after the sentencing or it will only make it worse. And he added that the president should let him get sentenced, play the racism card, give him a ticker tape when he comes home. Ambassador Sondland further told the president that Sweden, quote, should have released him on your word, but that you can tell the Kardashians you tried.
So that's David Holmes's closest thing to talking to President Trump about the investigations. He heard from across the table someone else's conversation during which the White House meeting and the aide were not brought up by his own testimony. And so here's what Sondland said about that call with Trump.
Also, on July 26th, shortly after our Kiev meetings, I spoke by phone with President Trump. The White House, which has finally shared certain call dates and times with my attorneys, confirms this. The call lasted 5 minutes. I remember I was at a restaurant in Kiev, and I have no reason to doubt that this conversation included the subject of investigations. Again, given Mr. Giuliani's demand that President Zelensky make a public statement about investigations, I knew that investigations were important to President Trump. We did not discuss any classified information. Other witnesses have recently shared their recollection of overhearing this call. For the most part, I have no reason to doubt their accounts. It's true that the president speaks loudly at times, and it's also true, I think we primarily discussed ASAP Rocky. It's true that the president likes to use colorful language. Anyone who has met with him at any reasonable amount of time knows this. While I cannot remember the precise details, again, the White House has not allowed me to see any readouts of that call, and the July 26th call did not strike me as significant at the time. Actually, I would have been more surprised if President Trump had not mentioned investigations, particularly given what we were hearing from Mr. Giuliani about the president's concerns. However, I have no recollection of discussing Vice President Biden or his son on that call or after the call ended.
So there you go. I don't know why that was such a big deal in the hearings or in the press, but that's the call. All right. So then a week later, Rudy Giuliani met with President Zelensky's advisor, Andrei Yermak, a match made, as we heard earlier, by Kurt Volcker. And so here's Kurt Volcker, the special envoy to Ukraine, testifying what happened the first week of August after President Trump had that phone call with President Zelensky.
I connected Mayor Giuliani and Mr. Yermak by text and later by phone. They met in person on August 2nd, 2019. In conversations with me following that meeting, which I did not attend, Mr. Giuliani said that he had stressed the importance of Ukraine conducting investigations into what happened in the past, and Mr. Yermak stressed that he told Mr. Giuliani it is the government's program to root out corruption and implement reforms, and they would be conducting investigations as part of this process anyway.
So Rudy Giuliani pressed for investigations to Zelensky's administration, and Volcker continued.
Mr. Giuliani said he believed the Ukrainian president needed to make a statement about fighting corruption and that he had discussed this with Mr. Yermak. I said I did not think that this would be a problem since that is the government's position anyway. I followed up with Mr. Yermak, and he said that they would indeed be prepared to make a statement.
So Rudy Giuliani said that the Ukrainian president needed to make a statement about investigations, and Volcker continued.
On August 16th, Mr. Yermak shared a draft with me, which I thought looked perfectly reasonable. It did not mention Burisma or 2016 elections, but was generic. Ambassador Sondland and I had a further conversation with Mr. Giuliani, who said that in his view, in order to be convincing that this government represented real change in Ukraine, the statement should include specific reference to Burisma and 2016. Again, there was no mention of Vice President Biden in these conversations.
So Rudy Giuliani insisted the statement referenced Burisma in 2016. And Volcker continued.
Ambassador Sondland and I discussed these points, and I edited the statement drafted by Mr. Yermak to include these points to see how it looked. I then discussed it further with Mr. Yermak. He said that for a number of reasons, including the fact that Mr. Lutsenko was still officially the prosecutor general, they did not want to mention Burisma or 2016. I agreed, and the idea of putting out a statement was shelved. These were the last conversations I had about this statement, which were on or about August 17 to 18.
So mid-August, they give up writing the statement. And the statement is apparently the thing that Trump is withholding the money and the White House meeting for. And so if the White House meeting and the aid were conditioned on that statement, that means no meeting and no money, right? Here's Democratic lawyer Daniel Goldman discussing that with Kurt Volker.
Your testimony that based on the text that you wrote, linking the investigations and the 2016 election on July 25th to the White House meeting, you're saying that by this point in August, with this back and forth, that you were unaware that this public statement was a condition for the White House meeting?
I wouldn't have called it a condition. It's a nuance, I guess, but I viewed it as very helpful. If we could get this done, it would help improve the perception that President Trump and others had, and then we would get the date for a meeting. If we didn't have a statement, I wasn't giving up and thinking that, oh, well, then we'll never get a meeting.
And just to be clear, Volcker added,
at the time, I was connecting Mr. Yermak and Mr. Giuliani and discussing with Mr. Yermak and Ambassador Sondland a possible statement that could be made by the Ukrainian president. I did not know of any linkage between the hold on security assistance and Ukraine pursuing investigations. No one had ever said that to me, and I never conveyed such a linkage to the Ukrainians.
So while Volcker, Sondland, and Giuliani and Zelensky's people were going back and forth about the statement, a CIA official who was not a direct witness to anything sent an anonymous letter to the heads of the Congressional Intelligence Committees in the House and the Senate, telling them that the president, quote, is pressuring a foreign country to investigate one of the president's main domestic political rivals, unquote. And the letter described the president's July 25th phone call with President Zelensky. It also reported to Congress that the transcript of the July 25th call was removed from where transcripts are usually stored and placed in a location for classified material that would make the transcript more difficult to access. And so now it's mid-August. 3 weeks after the famous phone call, the aid hasn't been released. A CIA employee has sent a complaint to Congress, the whistleblower complaint, and no one knows the military aid is on hold except for some insiders. But the career regime changers in the know were nervous. And so here's William Taylor again. He's the regime change insider since the early W. Bush years and current ambassador to Ukraine, who said he could not serve as ambassador to Ukraine unless the policy he supports, the maintenance of the regime change with military aid, were to remain. Here's what he told Congress.
By mid-August, because the security assistance had been held for over a month for no reason that I could discern, I was beginning to fear that the long-standing U.S. policy of support for Ukraine was shifting. I called State Department Counselor Ulrich Breckbuhl to discuss this on August 21st. He said he was not aware of a change in policy, but would check on the status of the security assistance. My concern deepened the next day on August 22nd during a phone conversation with Mr. Morrison. I asked him if there had been a change in policy of strong support for Ukraine, to which he responded, "It remains to be seen." He also told me during this call that the president doesn't want to provide any assistance at all.
And Taylor continued.
Just days later, on August 27th, Ambassador Bolton arrived in Kyiv and met with President Zelensky. During their meeting, security assistance was not discussed. As far as I knew, the Ukrainians were not aware of the hold until August 29th.
So August 29th, 1 month and 4 days after the Trump phone call, is when we know for sure the Ukrainians knew the military aid was on hold. 3 days later was the day that Zelensky wanted to meet President Trump in Poland, but Trump didn't make it because of Hurricane Dorian, and so Vice President Pence headlined the Poland meeting. Here's the Democratic Party's lawyer, Daniel Goldman, asking National Security Council staffer Tim Morrison about the meeting that President Zelensky had with Vice President Pence.
I want to move forward to September, in early September, when the security assistance begins to more overtly be used as leverage to pressure the Ukrainians to conduct these investigations that President Trump wanted. Mr. Morrison, you accompanied Vice President Pence to Warsaw when he met with President Zelensky, is that right?
I was in Warsaw when the vice president was designated as the president's representative. I was accompanying Ambassador Bolton.
Understood. But you were at the bilateral meeting with the vice president and President Zelensky, correct?
I was.
And in that meeting, were the Ukrainians concerned about the hold on military assistance, rather?
Yes.
What did they say?
It was the first issue that President Zelensky raised with Vice President Pence. They were very interested. They talked about its importance to Ukraine, its importance to the relationship.
And what was Vice President Pence's response?
The Vice President represented that it was a priority for him and that we were working to address, and he characterized President Trump's concerns about the state of corruption in Ukraine and the president's prioritization of getting the Europeans to contribute more to security sector assistance.
And did he directly explain to the Ukrainians that those were the actual reasons for the hold, or was he just commenting on general concerns of the president?
I don't know that he necessarily acknowledged a hold. He mentioned that we were reviewing the assistance. I mean, that's the way I heard it. That's the way I would characterize it. And those were the points he raised to help President Zelensky understand where we were in our process.
And to your knowledge, though, on sort of the staff level, as the coordinator of all the interagency process, you were not aware of any review of the Ukraine security assistance money, were you?
Well, we had been running a review. We had been running an interagency process to provide the president the information that I had been directed to generate for the president's consideration as to the state of interagency support for continuing Ukraine security sector assistance.
And the entire interagency supported the continuation of the security assistance, isn't that right?
That is correct.
And here's what Vice President Pence's staffer, Jennifer Williams, remembers about that meeting.
On August 29th, I learned that the Vice President would be traveling to Poland to meet with President Zelensky on September 1st. At the September 1st meeting, which I attended, President Zelensky asked the Vice President about news articles reporting a hold on U.S. security assistance for Ukraine. The Vice President responded that Ukraine had the United States' unwavering support and promised to relay their conversation to President Trump that night. During the September 1st meeting, neither the Vice President nor President Zelensky mentioned the specific investigations discussed during the July 25th phone call.
So Pence promised to help with the aid situation, and the investigations weren't brought up, which you would think they would be if Zelensky thought they were a prerequisite for getting the aid. But they weren't brought up. But the investigations were discussed after the meeting. Here's Democratic Party lawyer Daniel Goldman talking to National Security Council staffer Tim Morrison.
Now, after this larger meeting with Vice President Pence and President Zelensky, You testified at your deposition that you saw Ambassador Sondland immediately go over and pull Andrei Yermak aside and have a conversation. Is that right?
I mean, it was President Zelensky left the room, Vice President Pence left the room, and in sort of an ante-room, Ambassador Sondland and Presidential Advisor Yermak had this discussion, yes.
And what did Ambassador Sondland tell you that he told Mr. Yermak?
That the Ukrainians would have to have the Prosecutor General make a statement with respect to the investigations as a condition of having the aid lifted.
So Gordon Sondland tied the aid to the investigations. And here's Gordon Sondland's explanation of what happened that day.
There was a September 1st meeting with President Zelensky in Warsaw. Unfortunately, President Trump's attendance at the Warsaw meeting was canceled due to Hurricane Dorian. Vice President Pence attended instead. I mentioned to Vice President Pence before the meetings with the Ukrainians that I had concerns that the delay in aid had become tied to the issue of investigations. I recall mentioning that before the Zelensky meeting. During the actual meeting, President Zelensky raised the issue of security assistance directly with Vice President Pence, and the Vice President said that he would speak to President Trump about it. Based on my previous communication with Secretary Pompeo, I felt comfortable sharing my concerns with Mr. Yermak. It was a very, very brief pull-aside conversation that happened within a few seconds. I told Mr. Yermak that I believed that the resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine took some kind of action on the public statement that we had been discussing for many weeks.
Sondland also added,
President Trump never told me directly that the aid was conditioned on the meetings. The only thing we got directly from Giuliani was that the Burisma in 2016 elections were conditioned on the White House meeting. The aid was my own personal, guess based, again, on your analogy, 2 + 2 = 4.
4 minutes later, Sondland clarified this statement.
Again, I don't recall President Trump ever talking to me about any security assistance, ever.
And so if Trump didn't tell Sondland that the aid was contingent upon investigations, where did Sondland get that idea from? Here's Sondland responding to questions by the Republicans' lawyer, Stephen Castor.
I think once that Politico article broke, it started making the rounds that, if you can't get a White House meeting without the statement, what makes you think you're going to get a $400 million check? Again, that was my presumption.
Okay. But you had no evidence to prove that, correct?
That's correct.
So Trump wasn't Sondland's source for the idea that the aid would flow only if the investigation was announced. Sondland was Sondland's source for that. But he had a conversation with Trump in the days that followed in which he tried to get some clarification.
I finally called the president. I believe it was on the 9th of September. I can't find the records, and they won't provide them to me. But I believe I just asked him an open-ended question, Mr. Chairman. What do you want from Ukraine? I keep hearing all these different ideas and theories and this and that. What do you want? And it was a very short, abrupt conversation. He was not in a good mood. And he just said, I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. Something to that effect.
The same day as Sondland's phone call with Trump, the House Select Committee on Intelligence announced that an investigation was being launched into this whole thing. And 2 days later, on September 11th, the aid was released. And we don't know why it was released that day, but there is evidence that the aid was never going to be withheld past the September 30th deadline. Here's Laura Cooper of the Defense Department answering questions posed by Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas.
There were 2 ways that we would be able to implement presidential guidance to stop obligating the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. And the first option would be for the president to do a rescission. The second is a reprogramming action that the Department of Defense would do.
And both of those would require congressional notice.
Yes, sir.
There would be an extra step that the president would have to take to notify Congress. As far as you know, was there ever any notice that was sent out to Congress?
Sir, I did express that I believed it would require a notice to Congress, right, and that then there was no such notice to my knowledge or preparation of such a notice to my knowledge.
And in the end, Ukraine got all the money. And here's how. Again, USAI is the Defense Department's share of the money, and here's Laura Cooper again.
After the decision to release the funds on September 11th of this year, my colleagues across the DoD Security Assistance Enterprise worked tirelessly to be able to ultimately obligate about 86% of the funding by the end of the fiscal year, more than they had originally estimated they would be able to. Due to a provision in September's continuing resolution appropriating an amount equal to the unobligated funds from fiscal year 2019, we ultimately will be able to obligate all of the USAI funds.
So there you go. 2 days after the aid was released on 9/11 was the day that President Zelensky was scheduled to go on Fareed Zakaria's CNN show, but Zelensky never did. And so in the end, there was no White House meeting, but Trump and Zelensky did meet in Washington, D.C. on camera, actually, on September 25th. And the military aid was transferred to Ukraine in full. And President Zelensky, who ran on ending the war, actually just agreed on December 10th to a ceasefire with President Putin of Russia. Zelensky agreed to pull back Ukrainian troops in 3 regions, and Putin agreed to release fighters who are being held in prisons. So the war might be coming to an end in the early part of next year, which is definitely some good news. Finally, some good news. But now, you've heard the most damning evidence for yourself. So let's look at the 2 articles of impeachment. Article 1, abuse of power. The article says, quote, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into a political opponent, former Vice President Joseph Biden Jr., and a discredited theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 26th United States presidential election, unquote. The first impeachment article also says Trump, quote, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, conditioned 2 official acts on the public announcements that he had requested. A, the release of $391 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated, unquote, and, quote, a head of state meeting at the White House, unquote. And the part that I keep focusing on here is, quote, President Trump acting both directly and through his agents, unquote. Directly? Really? The article says that twice, but was that really proven based on what we just heard? Because what I heard is that Rudy Giuliani was definitely pushing for those particular investigations. But did anyone get that order directly from Donald Trump? Laura Cooper of the Defense Department?
Let me say at the outset that I have never discussed this or any other matter with the president and never heard directly from him about this matter.
How about Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor? Or Deputy Assistant Secretary of State George Kent? You guys talked to Trump?
Example of that, Ambassador Taylor, is that you testified in your prior testimony that you have not had any contact with the President of the United States. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Ms. Taylor, Mr. Kent, have you had any contact with the President of the United States?
I have not.
They have not. Everyone who thought the aid and the meeting was conditioned had talked to the rich guy who gave Trump's inauguration $1 million and then became ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland. The guy that doesn't take his own notes, and Gordon Sondland. And so here's Ambassador to Ukraine, the guy who should be the most in the know, William Taylor.
I had learned that in Warsaw, after the meeting Vice President Pence had with President Zelensky, Ambassador Sondland had had meetings there and had described to Mr. Yermak, the assistant to President Zelensky, that the security assistance was also held pending announcement by President Zelensky in public of these investigations. Before that, I had only understood from Ambassador Sondland that the White House meeting was conditioned. And at this time, after I heard of this conversation, it struck me, it was clear to me that security assistance was also being held.
And just for clarification,
Mr. Goldman, what I can do here for you today is tell you what I heard from people. And in this case, it was what I heard from Ambassador Sondland.
And then there's Tim Morrison from Trump's National Security Council. Same source. Here he's being questioned by the Democrats' lawyer, Daniel Goldman.
What did Ambassador Sondland tell you that President Trump said to him?
If I recall this conversation correctly, this was where Ambassador Sondland related that there was no quid pro quo, but President Zelensky had to make the statement and that he had to want to do it.
And by that point, did you understand that the statement related to the Biden and 2016 investigations?
I think I did, yes.
And that was essentially a condition for the security assistance to be released?
I understood that that's what Ambassador Sondland believed.
And then there's Iraq War vet on the National Security Council, Alex Vindman, who also got his information from Gordon Sondland.
To the best of my recollection, Ambassador Sondland said that in order to get a White House meeting, the Ukrainians would have to provide a deliverable, which is investigations, specific investigations.
And so where did Sondland get it from?
I know that members of this committee frequently frame these complicated issues in the form of a simple question. Was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously, with regard to the requested White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes. Mr. Giuliani conveyed to Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volcker, and others that President Trump wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing to investigations of Burisma and the 2016 election. Mr. Giuliani expressed those requests directly to the Ukrainians, and Mr. Giuliani also expressed those requests directly to us. We all understood that these prerequisites for the White House call and the White House meeting reflected President Trump's desires and requirements. As I testified previously, Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigations of the 2016 election, DNC server, and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President. Again, through Mr. Giuliani, we were led to believe that that's what he wanted.
It wasn't really a presumption. You heard from Mr. Giuliani.
Well, I didn't hear from Mr. Giuliani about the aid. I heard about the Burisma in 2016.
And you understood at that point, as we discussed 2 + 2 = 4, that
That's
the
right.
aid was there as well.
That was the problem, Mr. Goldman. No one told me directly that the aid was tied to anything. I was presuming it was.
So Rudy Giuliani told him the meeting was tied, and no one told him the aid was tied. Here's Stephen Castor, the Republicans' lawyer, questioning Sondland.
Did the president ever tell you personally about any preconditions for anything?
No.
Okay, so the president never told you about any preconditions for the aid to be released?
No.
The president never told you about any preconditions for a White House meeting?
Personally, no.
And in case that wasn't clear enough, here's Representative Michael Turner of Ohio talking to Gordon Sondland.
Well, after you testified, Chairman Schiff ran out and gave a press conference and said he gets to impeach the President of the United States because of your testimony. And if you pull up CNN today, right now, their banner says Sondland ties Trump to withholding aid. Is that your testimony today, Ambassador Sondland, that you have evidence that Donald Trump tied the investigations to the aid? Because I don't think you're saying that.
I've said repeatedly, Congressman, I was presuming. I also said that President Trump...
So no one told you, not just the President. Giuliani didn't tell you, Mulvaney didn't tell you, nobody, Pompeo didn't tell you, nobody else on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying aid to these investigations. Is that correct?
I think I already testified.
No, answer the question. Is it correct? No one on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying this aid to the investigations? Because if your answer is yes, then the chairman's wrong and the headline on CNN is wrong. No one on this planet told you that President Trump was tying aid to investigations. Yes or no?
Yes.
So Sondland was the source for most of the witnesses, and Sondland's source was Giuliani on the meeting and his own imagination on the aid. The only thing that's clear to me here is that we really really need to hear from Rudy Giuliani because all roads lead to him. And I can hear your screams of, but Rudy Giuliani is Trump's personal lawyer, which is why it's really fucking important to find out if Giuliani was acting on an order from Donald Trump, or did Rudy Giuliani want these investigations and go running his mouth to try and get them, flexing muscles he didn't officially have? And we don't know because Rudy Giuliani didn't testify. He defied his congressional subpoena. And when he defied the subpoena, Giuliani said, quote, if they enforce it, then we'll see what happens, unquote. But no one from Congress sent the sergeant at arms to arrest his ass. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But as for the charge of abuse of power, after watching over 40 hours of testimony, not a single person could say that Donald Trump himself tied the military aid or the White House meeting to the investigations. And I feel like that matters when we're talking about a process that could remove an elected president from office. To be clear, I don't like Donald Trump, but to remove someone elected with our votes from office for the first time in our history, I think we should be damn sure he did it. And the it that matters is withholding military aid. And we already know from testimony that that's not a crime. And it turns out, I didn't understand this before now, but it turns out that a president can be impeached and removed from office without committing a crime. And so this is Norm Eisen. He's the Democrats' lawyer on the House Judiciary Committee, questioning Professor Michael Gerhardt of the University of North Carolina, who has written 6 books, including books on impeachment.
Professor Gerhardt, does a high crime and misdemeanor require an actual statutory crime?
No, it plainly does not. Everything we know about the history of impeachment reinforces the conclusion that impeachable offenses do not have to be crimes. And again, not all crimes are impeachable offenses. We look at the context and gravity of the misconduct.
So crimes don't have to be committed in order for impeachment to move forward, which is how this was allowed to happen. But crimes always have been. Here's Professor Jonathan Turley of the George Washington University Law School, who's the only lawyer called to the House Judiciary Committee that I was actually familiar with before that hearing. I first started listening to Jonathan Turley in the W. Bush years when he taught me all of the reasons that Republican President George W. Bush could and should be impeached for war crimes, including for torturing people. And Jonathan Turley said in the hearing that he's a Democrat. So it's been very bizarre to watch him be branded as just some Republican stooge because of his testimony. But basically, and I don't trust many people, but I do trust this guy. And so I'm just putting that out there. And this is what he said.
There's a reason why every past impeachment has established crimes. And it's obvious. It's not that you can't impeach on a non-crime. You can. In fact, non-crimes have been part of past impeachments. It's just that they've never gone up alone or primarily as the basis of impeachment. That's the problem here. If you prove a quid pro quo, that you might have an impeachable offense. But to go up only on a non-criminal case would be the first time in history. So why is that the case? The reason is that crimes have an established definition and case law. So there's a concrete, independent body of law that assures the public that this is not just political, that this is a president who did something they could not do. You can't say the president is above the law if you then say the crimes you accuse him of really don't have to be established.
And that's what's happening here, or what's happened. He's already been impeached. In the hearings, President Trump was repeatedly accused, by the Democrats, of course, of extortion and bribery in particular. But that crime wasn't included in the articles of impeachment. And maybe this is why. Here's Professor Jonathan Turley.
This is one of the thinnest records ever to go forward on impeachment. I mean, the Johnson record, once again, we can debate because that was the 4th attempt at an impeachment. But this is certainly the thinnest of a modern record. If you take a look at the size of the record of Clinton and Nixon, they were massive in comparison to this, which is almost wafer thin in comparison. And it has left doubts, not just doubts in the minds of people supporting President Trump, doubts in the minds of people like myself about what actually occurred. There's a difference between requesting investigations and a quid pro quo. You need to stick the landing on the quid pro quo. You need to get the evidence to support it. It might be out there, I don't know, but it's not in this record. I agree with my colleagues. We've all read the record, and I just come to a different conclusion. I don't see
proof of a quid pro quo, no matter what my presumptions, assumptions, or bias might be.
And as he alluded to, I should say this, the other three lawyers did say that they wanted impeachment to go forward, but I decided to play that clip. So there you go. But and the reason I decided to play that clip is because that's where I've landed on this too. You know, there's a lot of people that we need to hear from and haven't, with number one on my list being Rudy Giuliani, who isn't in government and therefore wouldn't be covered under any claim of executive privilege. Attorney-client privilege, maybe. But he needed to be hauled in for questioning. He's too key a figure to be left out of this. And so with the evidence that was presented that you just heard, I would have voted no on charge number 1, abuse of power. There's not enough direct evidence that the desire for an announcement of investigations was the primary reason for the hold. There were other plausible reasons, most notably the fact that a review on all foreign aid was being conducted, the fact that there was a brand new administration in Ukraine that we didn't really know where they stood on yet, and the fact that there was a new Congress in Ukraine that didn't take office until August 29th, which was a month after the phone call, and that the Trump administration for 3 years straight didn't want to give most of the money in question to Ukraine to begin with. Between the plausible, appropriate reasons for delaying the aid and the fact that no one could testify that they heard Trump himself tie the meeting or the aid to the statement being given on CNN, I just can't support overturning our votes for president for this. But clearly, the vast majority of the Democratic Party in the House would disagree with me. Because when it came down to the vote for Article 1, abuse of power, it was approved by all Democrats except for Representative Jeff Van Drew of New Jersey, who left the Democratic Party and became a Republican the day after the vote, and Representative Colin Peterson of Minnesota, who longtime Congressional Dish listeners know well as a Democrat that has voted against the Democratic Party over and over and over again to help Republicans do favors for their beloved corporate interests. Joining the vast majority of Democrats in their yes votes was also newly independent Representative Justin Amash of Michigan. And as for the Republicans, not a single one of them voted for Article 1. And there were 2 representatives who didn't vote at all. I should mention them. One was Representative Duncan Hunter, who's a Republican who just pled guilty to basically being a corrupt motherfucker who used campaign funds to fly his pet bunny around the country. Literally, he did that, amongst other illegal uses of campaign funds. And so he's basically not going to be in Congress all that much longer. And Tulsi Gabbard, who was there, but voted present. And if you care why, I know she explained her vote on her Twitter page. I personally just don't care. But I do care that this went forward without so many key witnesses giving testimony, which brings me to charge number 2, obstruction of Congress. The second article of impeachment says that President Trump abused the powers of his office by, quote, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees, unquote, and, quote, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record, unquote. And, quote, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, unquote. And then it names 9 people, including Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, who is the guy that we know ordered the hold on military aid. And so that's another key witness that we definitely needed to hear from. I mean, really, if we could just get Mick Mulvaney and Rudy Giuliani to answer questions under oath, we'd pretty much be able to find out what happened and how much of this originated in President Trump's brain. Because the idea that people working for Donald Trump might be running rogue, you know, Donald Trump, a man we know likes to sleep in and golf and watch hours of Fox News every single day. The idea that that guy wouldn't be in complete control of his people doesn't seem all that far-fetched to me. With Trump's schedule packed with so many hours of fucking around, it seems plausible that he could have wanted the investigations. Trump clearly wanted the investigations. But that Rudy Giuliani took it from there, telling people that the White House meeting was tied to the investigations, and doing that on his own without Trump having ordered him to do so. Because we all know that Rudy Giuliani likes to run his mouth. And it's also plausible to me that anti-government zealot Mick Mulvaney, who used to be a congressman during the Congressional Dish years, he was on our radar way before Trump became president. Well, it makes sense to me that he, as chief of staff, could put a hold on foreign aid to a country in a political transition without Trump having much to do with it. You know, basically, I have reasonable doubt that really only Rudy Giuliani and Mick Mulvaney can solve. But President Trump prevented them from testifying by claiming that his people have absolute immunity from testifying, which really is the broadest claim of privilege I've ever seen. Like, even Dick Cheney didn't dare go that far. And so on its face, the obstruction of Congress charge makes sense for the reasons articulated by Professor Gerhardt.
The obstruction of Congress is a problem because it undermines the basic principle of the Constitution. If you're going to have three branches of government, each of the branches has to be able to do its job. The job of the House is to investigate impeachment and to impeach. A president who says, as this president did say, I will not cooperate in any way, shape, or form with your process, robs a coordinate branch of government. He robs the House of Representatives of its basic constitutional power of impeachment. When you add to that the fact that the same president says, my Department of Justice cannot charge me with a crime, the president puts himself above the law when he says he will not cooperate in an impeachment inquiry. I don't think it's possible to emphasize this strongly enough. A president who will not cooperate in an impeachment inquiry is putting himself above the law. Now, putting yourself above the law as president is the core of an impeachable offense, because if the president could not be impeached for that, he would, in fact, not be responsible to anybody.
So that makes sense to me. But when you look at the issue a bit deeper, it no longer seems so clear. Here's Professor Jonathan Turley again, and this is a long clip, and it's the only one today that I edited in the middle. You know, I took out some of the stuff in the middle of the clip because he went into the weeds a bit. And if you want to hear exactly what he said, weeds and all, you can find the timestamp for this clip in the show notes. And again, that's the case for every single clip that I've played for you today. I want you to be able to hear all of this in context if you'd like to. So use the damn show notes. And also, just for your information, you're going to hear a reference to Don McGahn, who was a key witness that Trump prevented from cooperating in the Mueller investigation.
I'd also caution you about obstruction. Obstruction is a crime also with meaning. It has elements. It has controlling case authority. The record does not establish obstruction in this case. That is, what my esteemed colleague said was certainly true. If you accept all of their presumptions, it would be obstruction. But impeachments have to be based on proof, not presumptions. That's the problem when you move towards impeachment on this abbreviated schedule that has not been explained to me. Why you want to set the record for the fastest impeachment. Fast is not good for impeachment. Narrow, fast impeachments have failed. Just ask Johnson. So the obstruction issue is an example of this problem. And here's my concern. The theory being put forward is that President Trump obstructed Congress by not turning over material requested by the committee. Okay? And citations have been made to the third article of the Nixon impeachment. Now, first of all, I want to confess, I've been a critic of the third article of the Nixon impeachment my whole life. My hair catches on fire every time someone mentions the third article. Why? Because you would be replicating one of the worst articles written on impeachment. Here's the reason why. Peter Rodino's position as chairman of Judiciary was that Congress alone decides what information may be given to it. Alone. His position was that the courts have no role in this. And so, by that theory, any refusal by a president based on executive privilege or immunities would be the basis of impeachment. That is essentially the theory that's being replicated today. President Trump has gone to Congress, to the courts. He's allowed to do that. We have 3 branches, not 2. You're saying Article 1 gives us complete authority that when we demand information from another branch, it must be turned over or we'll impeach you in record time. Now, making that worse is that you have such a short investigation. It's a perfect storm. You set an incredibly short period, demand a huge amount of information, and when the president goes to court, you then impeach him. In Nixon, it did go to the courts, and Nixon lost.
And that was the reason Nixon resigned. He resigned a few days after the Supreme Court ruled against him in that critical case. But in that case, the court recognized there are executive privilege arguments that can be made. It didn't say, you had no right coming to us, don't darken our doorstep again. It said, we've heard your arguments, we've heard Congress's arguments, and you know what? You lose. Turn over the material to Congress. Do you know what that did for the judiciary is it gave this body legitimacy. Now, recently, there are some rulings against President Trump, including a ruling involving Don McGahn. Mr. Chairman, I testified in front of you a few months ago, and if you recall, we had an exchange, and I encouraged you to bring those actions. And I said I thought you would win, and you did. And I think it was an important win for this committee, because I don't agree with President Trump's argument in that case. But that's an example of what can happen if you actually subpoena witnesses and go to court. Then you have an obstruction case, because a court issues an order, and unless they stay that order by a higher court, you have obstruction. But I can't emphasize this enough, and I'll say it just one more time. If you impeach a president, if you make a high crime and misdemeanor out of going to the courts, it is an abuse of power. It's your abuse of power.
And with that argument, Jonathan Turley flipped me. Like I said earlier, the Democrats never enforced their power by arresting anyone who defied their subpoenas. And the courts were never given the chance to compel compliance with those subpoenas. The courts have the ability to move these questions on expedited timelines. In fact, one of them, as I noted earlier in this episode, it could have been done by mid-December, but the Democrats refused to wait. In fact, the Democrats skipped huge steps in their own plans for impeachment because the impeachment inquiry was referred to 6 committees. Now, the House Judiciary Committee, where the lawyers testified, is the main committee charged with actually passing the articles of impeachment. And they did have one hearing with the constitutional lawyers, but they didn't question a single witness to Trump's not a crime. All of the fact-finding hearings that you've been hearing clips from today took place in the House Select Committee on Intelligence. But then there were 4 other committees. There was the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the House Oversight Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee, and the House Financial Services Committee. All of them were referred in this impeachment inquiry to do investigations, but they played no role in this at all. They had no hearings, nothing, which is the same role the judicial branch was allowed to play in this as well. The third co-equal branch of government has been totally sidelined. And that's such a shame because we need to have some rulings on the limits of the executive branch and especially their privilege. We've needed it, I'm sure, for longer than this, but definitely since the W. Bush years. But the plain fact is that President Trump is allowed to claim executive privilege and go to court. And the speed of this impeachment prevented the courts from finishing their work. And so because of that, despite President Trump's offensive claim of absolute immunity, I would have had to vote no on Article number 2 also, 100% because of the Democrats' decision to move ahead with this at warp speed. And on Article 2, again, my position was not popular with the Democratic Party. Surprise, surprise. Every independent and Democrat, and except for 3 this time, voted to impeach on obstruction of Congress. And the exceptions were now Republican Representative Jeff Van Drew of New Jersey, Representative Colin Peterson of Minnesota again, and joining them in this no vote was a 3rd Democrat, Representative Jared Golden of Maine. And once again, every Republican voted no. Now from here, the impeachment process moves into the Senate, where there will be wall-to-wall coverage of a trial, which will determine whether or not President Trump gets to stay in office. And they may or may not call more witnesses. They can. But for now, you've heard for yourself the strongest evidence against Donald Trump. And if you have opinions on anything you've heard today, please contact your sentencers. They will be the jury, and they're the only people with any power to do anything about this from here on forward. And so, before I walk away to eat pie, be merry, and honestly ignore this for a while, I really don't want to debate this over the holidays. So just FYI, if you want to yell at me, you might get ignored. But here's my final thoughts on this whole shit show. The big picture for me is that this all started with a regime change. In late 2013 and early 2014, members of our government, which at the time was led by the Democratic Party, handpicked a government for Ukraine and has been conditioning money and weapons on Ukraine, changing their laws to our liking ever since. And a new president, an outsider, dared to fuck with that project and now has been impeached. This is the storyline that's hidden in plain sight. The misdeed at the heart of this was withholding weapons of war from a government that the regime changers were propping up. And the investigation that was so offensive to suggest be conducted was won into the Vice President of the United States, who personally got the deets to stick on that regime change. You can't go looking into that guy in Ukraine. And that's the part of this I find the most offensive. That the one policy that survives administration after administration, Congress after Congress, no matter who we vote for, is an unwavering support for war. Let this be a lesson to any commoner, any outsider who dares to intervene in the maintenance of a regime change again. You shall be impeached. And the clip that really hammered this home for me, and that I want to end this impeachment episode with today, is the clip that I'll remember for the rest of my life. This is a clip from a CNN town hall held with Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, the decider on impeachment, on December 5th. Because I changed as a person after the W. Bush administration overthrew Iraq. I changed when I found out that my country tortured people, a crime so clear that it needed no investigations, although there were investigations, and they fucking did it. I wanted the people who did that in our names locked up in cages for life. At the very least, I wanted them stripped of their power. And so, 2006 was the first midterm election that this millennial bothered to vote in. And I voted for the Democrats because I wanted W. Bush and Cheney impeached for their war crimes. And so, with that in mind, here's a question posed to Nancy Pelosi right in the middle of the Trump impeachment process.
So, Speaker Pelosi, you resisted calls for the impeachment of President Bush in 2006 and President Trump following the Mueller report earlier this year. This time is different. Why did you oppose impeachment in the past? And what is your obligation to protect our democracy from the actions of our president now?
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up the question about, because when I became Speaker the first time, there was overwhelming call for me to impeach President Bush on the strength of the war in Iraq, which I vehemently opposed. And again, I say again, I said it other places. That was my wheelhouse. I was intelligence. I was a ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, even before I became part of the leadership of Gang of Four. So I knew there were no nuclear weapons in Iraq. It just wasn't there. They had to show us. They had to show the Gang of Four all the intelligence they had. The intelligence did not show that that was the case. So I knew it was a misrepresentation to the public. But having said that, it was in my view, not a ground for impeachment. They won the election, they made a representation, and to this day, people think that it was the right thing to do. And people think that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. I mean, it's appalling what they did. But I did, and I said, if somebody wants to make a case, you bring it forward. But they had impeached Bill Clinton for personal indiscretion and misrepresenting about it. Impeached him. Some of these same people are saying, oh, this doesn't rise to impeachment. We're right there impeaching Bill Clinton for being stupid in terms of something like that. I mean, I love him. I think he was a great president. But being stupid in terms of that and what would somebody do not to embarrass their family. But in any event, and that's so they did. Bill Clinton. Now they want me to do George. I just didn't want it to be a way of life in our country. As far as the Mueller report, there was a good deal of academics said, and 1,000 legal experts wrote a statement that said the Mueller report is an what's in there is an impeachable offense. It wasn't so much of what's in the Mueller report will be more clear once some of the court cases are resolved. But it wasn't so clear to the public. The Ukraine just removed all doubt. It was self-evident that the president undermined our national security, jeopardized the integrity of our elections as he violated his oath of office. There's just, that's something that cannot be ignored.
She knew from the beginning that George W. Bush lied us into a war where thousands of Americans died, hundreds of thousands of humans overseas died, and a war where people were tortured. And that wasn't grounds for impeachment for her. She, quote, just didn't want it to be a way of life in our country, unquote, as if an impeachment for war crimes and torture is the same as an impeachment over a blowjob. They're not. But flash forward a decade later, after her party overthrew a government and a new president, an outsider, was looking like he was going to cut off war money. On top of that, he was also interfering with the Democratic Party presidential campaign. Now that is something that cannot be ignored. War crimes, actual crimes, not impeachable. Withholding war money, investigate a warmonger from her party? How dare you? You know, the Republican Party is obviously full of monsters. They committed the war crimes, they did the torture, and they're defending Trump no matter what he says or does. But with this impeachment, the Democratic Party has exposed themselves as full of monsters too. These are people more interested in protecting their regime change and their head regime changer than protecting the people in the cages, or stopping indiscriminate drone bombs, or dismantling the domestic spying network that was started by W, but that their Democratic administration under Obama lied about and expanded to, or getting justice for all of those people tortured and killed. Republicans and Democrats. The only solution that I can come up with to this problem of an incurable rot on both houses is the same solution that I keep coming back to. Hashtag fire them all. And there's no better justification for us Americans to enact a mass firing than this impeachment debacle. With the passionate speeches in both directions, the ones claiming that withholding regime change money or investigating a Democrat is the greatest threat ever to our country, or the speeches claiming that there's zero evidence that Trump has done anything wrong, zero evidence, really? They're all full of shit. At this point, there is not a single person in the House of Representatives worth keeping, except for maybe Tulsi Gabbard because she refused to participate in this. But basically, the party loyal are all corrupt. They're collectively fine with letting Trump bomb people indiscriminately because presidents from both parties have bombed indiscriminately. They're collectively fine with letting Trump shamelessly profit from his office because they profit from their offices too, by being allowed to make bets on the stock market while simultaneously writing laws, giving them all insider knowledge into how laws are about to change. They collectively won't touch Trump's campaign finance violation, paying off Stormy Daniels and the crimes of obstruction of justice and witness tampering laid out in regards to Michael Cohen in the Mueller report, because campaign finance violations? Oh, that's a Pandora's box that no one dare touch. There are real crimes happening in the Trump administration, but instead of impeaching those, which might reflect badly upon their own behavior, the supposed good guys impeach over this. And I can't stand it. I can't stand any of them anymore. But here, because I need to have hope somewhere, here's our silver lining on this last episode of 2019. President Trump has been impeached, but he has a snowball's chance in hell of being removed from office for this in the Republican sycophant-dominated Senate. And so the weak standard for impeachment precedent that this is going to set is going to be limited. But the hope comes from the fact that we're just a few days away from 2020, election year. If you, like I, don't like President Trump, if you don't like his actions towards Ukraine, which for the record I don't, asking for investigations into Hunter Biden is some immoral bullshit regardless of who or how or if it was connected to military aid. But if you don't like the spike in deaths caused by the Trump administration's indiscriminate drone bombs, if you don't like the number of people being held indefinitely in private prisons on U.S. soil for misdemeanors, or if you just don't like him, we can vote him out in 2020. Our chance is coming. And if you, like me, are disgusted with members of Congress from both parties for always funding the government late and attaching corporate favors to those must-sign bills, for passing 2,000-page legislation into law that's been publicly available to read for less than a day, or for the never-ending wars, well, we can fire our lawmakers in 2022. As in 2020 also. Although we can fire the House in 2022 because we have the opportunity to replace every single member of the House of Representatives every 2 years. And our next chance is less than a year from now. Every single one of them in the House, every single one of them that voted for or against this impeachment is up for election, and we can replace them with other people. You know, we as voters can just all agree that no incumbents get to stay. Because how great would it be to have a Congress where none of them have been involved with any of the corruption of the past, where none of them are tainted? How great would it be to have a Congress that could impeach for real crimes without worrying about their own skeletons? How great would it be to have a Congress without the Nancy Pelosi's that have been in Congress for so long that they've convinced themselves that their behavior is normal and okay? And I know that this idea is probably unrealistic. It sure as hell hasn't happened yet. But we have to remind ourselves of what is possible. We can fire every single person involved in this impeachment on both sides. Every person who participated, every person who cast a vote, gone. Just because we haven't used our power, it doesn't mean that we can't. And so I'm going to end this year with hope. Because I know that while a lot of people won't agree with my conclusion on the impeachment, especially the majority of Americans who never bothered to examine the evidence presented and instead took headlines screaming bombshell at their word, but even the people who don't agree with me after hearing everything that I just presented, I know that even the people that support this impeachment are sick of this shit. We all know these people currently in office are protecting themselves, their campaigns, which they call our elections. But each one of us would still have received our ballots and had them counted regardless of anything said by the Ukrainian president on CNN. Don't confuse our elections with their campaigns. The fact is that we have done a terrible job of picking our lawmakers. And maybe this year enough of us are aware of it that we'll make a real effort to fix it. Because they've all failed us and they all deserve to go. And so with that, ending the year with yelling. Is anyone surprised? But with that, I'd like to thank you, seriously, sincerely, for supporting this show in 2019 and all the years prior. I'd like to thank you because this episode has the potential to f me royally financially with a wave of firings. Because when I told my dad, I'm in his house right now recording this on the floor, but when I told him that I was going to tell the world that I would have voted no on both impeachment articles, his only response was, "That's going to cost you." And he's my business manager. That's the part of this he cares about. And he's not happy about this episode. But the thing is that maybe not. Because this podcast is listener supported. Shows funded by advertising have to run on the popularity model. The show hosts need lots of listeners to sell to the corporate titans. But because of the value for value business model that we're using here for Congressional Dish, this show exists to serve you, not to sell you to the advertisers. It's a model that requires keeping your attention so that you can be counted for those advertisers. And the easiest way for them to do that is to feed you whatever bullshit they think you want to hear. Anything to keep you from changing the channel. And I clearly don't do that. And the editorial freedom that refusing corporate overlords affords us is only possible because of you, who pays for the show even though it's free. Because the deal is that I forego a reliable income to do this. This is my full-time job. And I operate on the faith that if you value my work, whether you agree with the opinions expressed or not, but if you value the work, the information that I give you, that you're getting nowhere else, you'll voluntarily pay for it. Just like how you voluntarily tip your waiters, drivers, and delivery peasants. Well, I'm your info peasant. And if you value this episode or any of the 205 episodes that have come before it, please pay for it using the most convenient option listed for you in the show notes. We happily accept monthly paper checks and PayPal subscriptions. We have a Patreon with some bonus content for per episode subscribers. And we take tips in the form of Venmo payments and Zelle payments, even cryptocurrency payments. You could also use paper checks for these too. And PayPal, now that I think about it. But the only number that's unfair on my end is 0. Everything else is much appreciated and all donors get thanked in bonus thank you episodes. And so leave a short note if you have questions or comments. The thank yous are where we get to chat. But if you like this show and if you're interested in the information I have on my new year to-do list, like reading through the multiple 1,000-page government funding laws to find the dingleberries, and reading through the over 3,000-page defense authorization for 2020 to find out Congress's plans for our wars, if you want to know about the congressional investigations that no one's talking about into toxic chemicals in our water, the investigation into the 737-8 MAX airplane crashes, the investigations going on into the people being kept indefinitely in cages in private prisons, or the investigations into the facial recognition software being used around the country by law enforcement, and the other investigations that the mainstream media ignores while covering all tweets Trump, will support this show, please. And if you do, I'll be back, and we can continue to hate everyone in Congress together. So thank you for listening, and happy holidays, and I will talk to you again in January.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end he'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.